The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. Red Hollow sat wedged between two canyon walls like a broken tooth, baking under a sun that never showed mercy. The town existed because the stagecoach line needed somewhere to change horses, and men needed somewhere to pretend civilization still mattered out here on the edge of nothing. Most frontier settlements at least tried to look respectable. Red Hollow had given up on that years ago. The main street, if you could call it that, was just packed dirt that turned to soup when it rained and dust when it didn't. Wooden buildings leaned against each other like drunks, their paint peeling in long strips that curled in the heat. The saloon sign hung crooked. The general store's windows were so caked with grime you couldn't see inside. Even the church at the end of town looked ashamed of itself, its cross tilted at an angle that suggested God himself had stopped paying attention. People moved through Red Hollow like ghosts. Quick, quiet, eyes down. That's how you survived here. Evelyn Cross understood that better than anyone. She lived above her sewing shop on the east side of the street, in two rooms that got so hot by midday she could barely breathe. The shop itself was small, just a front room with a table, her Singer's sewing machine, and bolts of fabric stacked against walls that hadn't seen fresh paint in a decade. A handwritten sign in the window read, "Alterations and Repairs," in letters so faded you had to squint to read them. Evelyn was 34, though the frontier had a way of making women look older. Her dark hair was always pulled back tight, showing the sharp angles of her face. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way the saloon girls painted themselves to be, but there was something in the set of her jaw, the straightness of her spine, that made men uncomfortable. She looked at you direct when she talked, which wasn't how women were supposed to act out here. Her husband Thomas had died 3 years back. Cholera, the doctor said, though the doctor was usually drunk, so who knew? Thomas had been a good man, steady, kind, boring as Sunday, and his death had surprised everyone by how little it changed things. Evelyn just kept sewing, kept paying rent, kept existing in that quiet, dignified way that made people respect her, even if they didn't particularly like her. She didn't cry at the funeral. That bothered folks. "It ain't natural," Martha Simmons had whispered to her husband. "A wife should weep." But Evelyn Cross had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. So she sewed, repaired torn shirts and patched dresses and hemmed trousers for men who smelled like horses and tobacco. She charged fair prices, did clean work, and never once complained about the heat or the dust or the loneliness that filled her rooms like smoke. People said she was strong. What they meant was she scared them a little. Across the street, past the feed store and the barber's, stood the blacksmith's forge. You could hear it before you saw it, the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, the hiss of hot metal hitting water, the roar of the furnace breathing like some underground creature. Boone Mercer had run that forge for 5 years. Nobody knew where he'd come from. He'd just appeared one morning with a wagon full of tools and enough silver to buy the old forge outright from the widow who'd been trying to sell it since her husband drank himself to death. Boone paid cash, didn't haggle, and had the furnace burning by sundown. He was massive. Not tall, maybe 5'11", but built like something carved from bedrock. His shoulders were so broad he had to turn sideways to fit through normal doorways. His arms were thick as fence posts, corded with muscle and cross-hatched with old scars that looked like they had stories nobody wanted to hear. His hands were huge, knuckles permanently swollen from years of gripping hammer handles and tongs. But it was his face that made people nervous. Boone Mercer had cold eyes, gray as winter sky, set deep under heavy brows. His face was all hard angles, square jaw, prominent cheekbones, nose that had been broken at least twice. A thick beard covered the lower half, shot through with gray despite him being maybe 40. He never smiled, never frowned. His expression stayed flat as hammered iron no matter what was happening around him. He spoke maybe 10 words a day. Yep and nope covered most situations. If you brought him work, he'd look at it, quote you a price, and get to it. He didn't chat, didn't drink at the saloon, didn't go to church or town meetings. When he wasn't working, he was in the small room behind the forge, and what he did in there was his own business. People whispered, of course. That's what people do. "He's running from something," said Pete Henderson, who ran the general store. "Law, probably," added his wife. "Why else would a man hide way out here?" "Maybe he just likes being alone," Evelyn had said once, which earned her strange looks. Truth was, Red Hollow suited Boone Mercer fine. People left him alone. He did good work. His horseshoes didn't throw, his wagon repairs lasted, his knives held an edge. Ranchers came from 2 counties over for his services. He charged fair prices and delivered on time. He never caused trouble. And that was the problem, when trouble finally came looking. The Ryder gang first showed up on a Tuesday in late summer, when the heat was so thick you could chew it. There were 8 of them. You could tell they were outlaws from how they rode, loose and arrogant, rifles across their saddles like decorations, dust coating their clothes in a way that said they'd been moving fast. They came down the main street at midday when everyone was trying to survive the worst of the sun. Dorian Ryder rode point. He wasn't what you'd expect from a gang leader. No wild eyes or savage beard. Dorian was almost handsome, tall and lean with dark hair slicked back, a neat mustache, and clothes that looked expensive even covered in trail dust. He wore a long black coat despite the heat, and a silver-plated pistol rode low on his hip. When he smiled, which he did often, it never reached his eyes. Those eyes were the problem. Pale green, like bottle glass, and completely empty of anything resembling humanity. The gang spread out, taking positions at both ends of the street while Dorian dismounted outside the saloon. His boots hit the dirt with deliberate slowness. He stood there for a long moment, looking around Red Hollow like a man appraising livestock. "Sheriff," he called out. Not loud, almost friendly. "I believe we need to have a conversation." The doors and windows that had still been open slammed shut. Sheriff Dale Hutchins came out of his office looking like a man walking to his own hanging. Dale was 56, with a gut that hung over his belt and a drinking problem everyone pretended not to notice. He'd been sheriff for 12 years, mostly because nobody else wanted the job. He was decent enough at breaking up saloon fights and hauling drunks to the jail cell, but actual law enforcement? That required a spine Dale didn't possess. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" His voice cracked on the last word. Dorian smiled. "I certainly hope so. See, my associates and I have been riding hard for several days. We're tired, thirsty, in need of supplies and hospitality. I trust Red Hollow is the kind of town that welcomes travelers?" It wasn't a question. "Of course," Dale said quickly. "The saloon's open, general store too. You're welcome to, How generous." Dorian pulled off his gloves slowly, finger by finger. "But here's the thing, Sheriff. Hospitality works both ways. You feed us, water our horses, let us rest, and in return we make sure nothing unfortunate happens to your nice little town. Seems fair, doesn't it?" The street was silent except for the wind pushing dust devils between the buildings. "You talking about protection?" Dale's voice had gone quiet. "I'm talking about reality." Dorian's smile vanished. "This territory is dangerous. Fires break out, accidents happen, people get hurt. But a town with the right friends? A town that understands how things work? That town stays safe. Costs you maybe $50 a month. Cheap insurance against disaster, wouldn't you say?" "That's..." Dale started, then caught himself. His hand moved toward his gun, then froze. You could see the math happening behind his eyes. 8 armed men. Him alone. The town watching. No good ending to this that involved courage. His hand dropped. "50 a month," he said quietly. "Payable when?" "First of every month." Dorian pulled his gloves back on. "And Sheriff? Make sure everyone understands. This arrangement covers the whole town. Anyone who doesn't want to participate." He shrugged. "Well, fire season's coming. Terrible things happen during fire season." He walked into the saloon like he owned it. His men followed, laughing. Dale stood in the street for another minute, staring at nothing. Then he turned and walked back to his office without looking at anyone. The door closed behind him with a sound like a tomb sealing. Inside her shop, Evelyn watched through the window. Across the street, in the darkness of the forge, Boone Mercer kept hammering. The first collection happened the next morning. 2 of Ryder's men, a scarred Mexican named Ortega and a younger one they called Finn, went door to door with a canvas bag. $50, they said. Protection fee. First month in advance. Most people paid without argument. Pete Henderson handed over the money with shaking hands. Martha Simmons cried but paid. The saloon keeper paid. The barber paid. The feed store owner tried to negotiate and Ortega broke his display window with a rifle butt. He paid. They came to Evelyn's shop just after noon. The bell above her door rang as they walked in, bringing the smell of sweat and gunpowder with them. Ortega was older, maybe 50, with a face like weathered leather and cold black eyes. Finn couldn't have been more than 22, blonde, with a sparse mustache, and the kind of nervous energy that made him dangerous. He kept touching his gun like he was reminding himself it was there. Evelyn was working on a dress, her hands steady on the fabric. She looked up without expression. "Help you, gentlemen?" "Protection fee," Ortega said. "No introduction, no pleasantries. $50. "For what exactly?" "For not burning your shop down." Finn grinned like he'd said something clever. Evelyn set down her work carefully. She stood, smoothing her apron. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly level. "I'm a widow running a sewing shop. I make maybe $20 a good month. You're asking for more than double what I earn. That's not protection. That's robbery." Ortega's expression didn't change. "That's the fee." "Then I can't pay it." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Finn stepped forward, hand moving to his gun. "You saying no to us?" "I'm saying I don't have $50. Evelyn met his eyes without flinching. "Burn the shop if you want. Won't get you any richer." Ortega studied her for a long moment. Something like respect flickered in his eyes, or maybe just recognition of another survivor. He put a hand on Finn's shoulder, stopping him. "You got until tomorrow to find the money," he said. "Borrow it. Sell something. I don't care how, but tomorrow we come back and you better have it. Understand? And if I don't, then we make an example." Ortega turned toward the door. "Boss wants everyone to understand how this works. You seem like a smart woman. Don't make us show you." They left. Evelyn stood there for a full minute, her hands balled into fists so tight her nails cut her palms. Then she sat down and went back to sewing, but her hands were shaking now, and the stitches came out crooked. That night, she tried to borrow money. She went to the general store first. Pete Henderson wouldn't meet her eyes. "Can't help you, Evelyn. I'm sorry. I just can't." The saloon keeper was more direct. "You're on your own." She tried 4 more businesses. Same story everywhere. People were scared. Nobody wanted to be seen helping someone who'd defied the Ryder gang. By the time she walked home, the sun was setting and she knew what was coming. She climbed the stairs to her rooms and sat by the window in the dark, watching the last light drain from the sky. Somewhere down the street, she could hear laughter from the saloon where Ryder's men were drinking. The sound carried in the still air like a promise of violence. Tomorrow, they would come. And she had nowhere to run. Across the street, the forge was dark and silent. Boone Mercer had finished work hours ago. His windows showed no light. Whatever he was doing in there, he was doing it in the dark. Evelyn wondered if he even knew what was happening in the town around him. She wondered if he cared. The answer to both questions was yes, but not in any way she could have predicted. Boone Mercer lay on his cot in the darkness behind the forge, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't asleep. He rarely slept more than a few hours. Old habits died hard, and staying alert had kept him alive through too many bad situations to count. He'd heard everything that happened in the street. The demands. The threats. The collection. The sound of Evelyn trying to borrow money and being turned away. Sound carried in Red Hollow's thin walls, and Boone had learned long ago to pay attention to his surroundings. He knew what was coming tomorrow. Part of him, the part that had kept him alive this long, said to stay out of it. Not your business, not your fight. You came here to disappear, not to become a target. The smart play was to keep his head down, pay the fee, and let the town deal with its own problems. But there was another part, older, deeper, harder to ignore. The part that remembered what happened when good people did nothing. He'd spent 5 years in Red Hollow building a quiet life, working, surviving, trying to become someone other than what he'd been. It wasn't much of a life, but it was clean, simple, free of blood. The sound of hammer on anvil echoed in his memory. Different hammers, different anvils, different purposes. Boone closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. It never did when violence was in the air. The next day dawned clear and hot, the sky already bleached white by 9 in the morning. Evelyn opened her shop at the usual time. She'd slept maybe 2 hours. Her face in the mirror looked hollow, but her hands were steady as she pinned her hair back. She dressed in her good dress, dark blue with a high collar, and pinned a silver brooch at her throat that had belonged to her mother. If they were going to make an example of her, she'd at least look dignified. The shop bell rang at 10 o'clock. This time it wasn't just Ortega and Finn. Dorian Ryder himself stood in her doorway, flanked by 4 of his men. He looked around the small shop with theatrical interest, picking up a spool of thread, examining a half-finished dress on the mannequin. "Charming," he said. "A woman with a trade. I admire that. So few people understand the value of honest work anymore." Evelyn stood behind her counter. "I don't have your money." "No?" Dorian set down the thread carefully. "I'm disappointed. Ortega said you seemed intelligent, but apparently you don't understand how this works." "I understand fine. You're thieves dressed up with fancy words." Finn laughed. Ortega looked at the ceiling. One of the other men, a heavy-set brute with a scarred face, cracked his knuckles. Dorian just smiled. Strong words from someone in a very weak position. "See, here's what I think happened. I think you decided to be brave, to stand up for principle. Maybe you thought other people would follow your example, that the town would rally behind you." He walked slowly around the shop, trailing his fingers along the fabric bolts. "But nobody came to help you last night, did they? Nobody's coming to help you now. You're alone, Mrs. Cross, just like you've always been." The words hit harder than a fist. "So here's what's going to happen," Dorian continued, his voice casual. "You're going to learn a lesson, and this town is going to watch and learn with you, because fear, real, proper fear, is the only language people truly understand." He nodded to his men. Evelyn tried to run. She made it 3 steps before they caught her. Hands grabbed her arms, her hair, her dress. She fought, nails, teeth, knees, but there were too many of them. They dragged her toward the door as she screamed and struggled. "Let everyone see," Dorian said calmly. "Do it in the street." They hauled her outside into the blazing sun. People appeared in windows and doorways, watching. Nobody moved to help. The sheriff's office door stayed closed. They threw Evelyn down in the dirt in front of her shop. She tried to stand and Finn kicked her back down. Laughter from the men. She scrambled up again, and the heavy one, his name was Sutton, grabbed her dress at the shoulder and tore. Fabric ripped, buttons scattered. Evelyn gasped and tried to cover herself, but Sutton tore again and again, until her dress hung in tatters and she was kneeling in the dirt in her underclothes, covered in dust, gasping for air. Dorian stood over her. "This is what happens when you say no. This is what defiance costs. Look at her." He raised his voice, addressing the town. "This is your neighbor, your seamstress, a woman who thought she was strong enough to stand alone." He crouched down, grabbed Evelyn's chin, forced her to look at him. "But you're not strong. You're nothing, just another piece of trash in a trash town." He shoved her back down. Evelyn lay there in the dirt, shaking. Not from fear, from rage so pure it felt like fire in her chest. She could hear people watching, could feel their eyes, could sense their pity and their shame and their relief that it was happening to her and not them. She pushed herself up to her knees, then to her feet. Stood swaying, covered in dirt and humiliation, her dress in ruins. Dorian watched with interest. "Still got some fight left?" Evelyn said nothing, just stood there, breathing hard, staring at him with eyes that promised murder. "Impressive." Dorian tipped his hat. "Most people stay down. Maybe you'll learn by next month. Fee's now $75, by the way. Price of defiance." He turned to walk away, then paused. "Oh, and anyone who helps her? Anyone who gives her money, clothes, or comfort? They go to 100 immediately, just so we're clear." The gang rode off laughing. Evelyn stood in the street alone. People watched from windows, from doorways, from the safety of shadows. Nobody came to help her. Nobody said a word. She stood there for maybe a minute, though it felt like hours, then turned and walked slowly back into her shop. The door closed behind her with a soft click. The street was silent except for the wind, and across the way, in the darkness of his forge, Boone Mercer stood perfectly still. He'd seen everything, every moment, every word, every person who watched and did nothing. His hands were clenched so tight around the hammer handle that the wood creaked. His jaw was locked. His breathing came slow and controlled, the way it did when he was fighting not to lose control entirely. He'd promised himself 5 years ago that he was done, that the man he'd been was dead and buried, that he'd never pick up violence again no matter what happened around him. But promises had a way of breaking when the world pushed hard enough. Boone set down his hammer very carefully. He walked to the forge doors and closed them, locked them from the inside. Then he stood there in the red glow of the furnace, staring at nothing, feeling something old and terrible waking up inside him. He knew what that feeling was, had spent years trying to bury it. But it was back now, patient and hungry as cancer, asking one simple question: how many men can you kill before they understand? Boone walked to the back of the forge where he kept his personal tools. There was a trunk there, old and scarred, locked with a heavy padlock. He hadn't opened it in 5 years. He opened it now. Inside was metal, good steel, already shaped, waiting. He'd known this day would come eventually, had known the moment he chose Red Hollow that a man couldn't really hide from what he was. Not forever. The world had a way of finding you and demanding you become your worst self one more time. Boone pulled out the pieces and laid them carefully on his workbench. Then he lit every lamp in the forge, stoked the furnace until it roared like a living thing, and got to work. 3 days and 3 nights. That's how long the hammer falls echoed through Red Hollow. Nobody saw Boone during that time. His doors stayed locked. His windows glowed red like the forge was burning from the inside. The sound was constant, the clang of hammer on steel, the hiss of water, the roar of fire. It didn't stop. Not for meals. Not for sleep. Not for anything. People started talking. "He's gone mad," Pete Henderson whispered. "Making something," said Martha Simmons. "Question is what?" "Weapons," suggested the barber. "Has to be weapons." Only Evelyn knew better. She'd reopened her shop the day after her humiliation, working with quiet determination to repair her dress and her dignity. People avoided her now. Customers stayed away. The protection money had isolated her more effectively than any fence, but at night, lying in her bed, she listened to the hammer falls carrying through the canyon and understood something the rest of the town didn't. Boone Mercer wasn't making weapons. He was making a decision. And Red Hollow was going to learn what that decision cost. The sound stopped on the 4th morning. Red Hollow woke to silence so complete it felt wrong. For 3 days and nights, the hammer falls had become a kind of heartbeat for the town, constant, relentless, almost comforting in its rhythm. Now there was nothing except the wind and the usual morning sounds of horses and creaking wood. Pete Henderson stood behind his store counter, staring at the wall like he could see through it to the forge across the way. His wife, Agnes, was restocking shelves, but her hands kept pausing mid-motion. "Think he's done?" she asked quietly. "Done with what?" Pete's voice was tight. "We don't even know what he was making. Making trouble, probably." Agnes set down a can of beans harder than necessary. Man locks himself away for 3 days straight, hammering like the devil himself. Nothing good comes from that. Maybe he was just working, catching up on orders. At midnight? At 3 in the morning? Pete, don't be stupid. He wanted to argue but couldn't. The truth was, everyone in Red Hollow had felt it, that sense of something building, gathering weight like storm clouds. The hammer falls had sounded different this time. Not the steady rhythm of horseshoes or wagon repairs. This had been harder, heavier, more deliberate, like a man settling accounts. "Maybe we should go check on him," Agnes said, though her tone suggested she thought no such thing. "You check on him. I've got inventory to do." They both stayed exactly where they were. Down the street, Sheriff Dale Hutchins sat at his desk with a bottle of whiskey he'd been working on since dawn. The star pinned to his shirt felt heavier every day. He'd taken it off twice in the last week, set it on the desk, stared at it for an hour. But he always pinned it back on because what else was he going to do? He was 56 years old with no skills except breaking up drunk fights and looking the other way when convenient. The Ryder gang had been back twice since the incident with Evelyn. Each time, Dorian had made a point of stopping by the sheriff's office, boots up on Dale's desk, smiling that empty smile. "How's law enforcement treating you, Sheriff?" "Fine." "Good, good. Important to maintain order in a town like this. Speaking of which," Dorian would gesture vaguely at the street, "I notice some of your citizens are still a bit resistant to our arrangement. That seamstress woman, for instance. She reopened her shop. Can't stop a woman from working her own business. Of course not. But you could encourage cooperation. Maybe explain to people that resistance only makes things harder." Dorian's smile never wavered. "After all, you're the sheriff. People listen to you, don't they?" They both knew people didn't listen to Dale Hutchins, hadn't for years. The badge was just decoration on a coward, and everybody knew it. Now Dale poured another drink and tried not to think about Evelyn Cross standing in the street in her torn dress while the whole town watched. Tried not to remember how he'd sat right here in this office, door closed, pretending not to hear her screaming. A man could only carry so much shame before it started eating him from inside. The bottle was half empty when he heard footsteps on the boardwalk outside. Heavy, deliberate, not hurrying. Dale's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. Through the window, he could see Boone Mercer walking down the center of the street in broad daylight. The blacksmith's face was covered in soot, his shirt dark with sweat despite the morning cool. His hands were wrapped in cloth, blacksmith's hands, burned and blistered from 3 days at the forge. But it was what he carried that made Dale's breath catch. A war hammer. Massive. The head had to weigh 20 pounds, mounted on a handle of dark oak. The metal was black as midnight, still radiating heat that made the air shimmer around it. Even from here, Dale could see the craftsmanship. This wasn't some crude weapon hammered together in rage. This was art. Terrible, beautiful art designed for one purpose only: breaking things. Boone walked past the sheriff's office without looking in. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, gray as winter sky, empty of everything except purpose. Dale watched him pass and did absolutely nothing. Just sat there with his bottle and his shame while a man walked toward violence in the middle of his town. What else was he supposed to do? Stop him? With what? Words? A badge? Dale had given up any pretense of authority the day he let Dorian Ryder walk into Red Hollow and plant his flag. The bottle went back to his lips. Outside, the street was waking up properly now. Shopkeepers opening doors, sweeping boardwalks, going through the morning routine. But one by one they stopped. Brooms stilled mid-sweep. Conversations died half-finished. People froze wherever they stood, staring at the man with the hammer walking down the center of the street like he owned it. Boone reached the water trough outside the saloon and stopped. He set the hammer down carefully, letting it rest against the trough. Then he cupped his hands, scooped water, and splashed it over his face and neck. The water ran black with soot, pooling at his feet. He did this 3 times, methodical, unhurried. Then he picked up the hammer and kept walking. Martha Simmons stood in her doorway, one hand clutched to her chest. "What's he doing?" she whispered to no one in particular. "Looking for trouble," her husband muttered. "Fool's going to get himself killed." "Should someone stop him? You want to try?" Neither of them moved. Boone reached the boarding house where the Ryder gang had set up camp. It was a 2-story building that had seen better decades, run by a widow named Clara Reed who'd had no choice but to accept the gang's money when they decided to stay. 8 men living under her roof, drinking her liquor, scaring her guests until the place was empty except for them. The front door was closed, curtains drawn despite the heat. Boone stood in the street outside for maybe 10 seconds. Just stood there, hammer in hand, staring at the building like he was memorizing every detail. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come. People exhaled. Tension drained from shoulders. Maybe he'd just been taking a walk, clearing his head after 3 days in the forge. Maybe... Boone stopped at Evelyn's shop. The door was open to catch the morning breeze. Evelyn sat at her sewing machine, working on a shirt. She'd heard the footsteps outside but hadn't looked up. Customers were rare now. Most people who needed sewing were taking their business 2 towns over rather than risk Dorian's attention. The shadow falling across her doorway made her glance up. Boone Mercer filled the frame, 6 feet of scarred muscle and bad intentions, warhammer resting on his shoulder like it weighed nothing. Evelyn's hand stilled on the fabric. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She'd lived across the street from this man for 3 years, seen him maybe 100 times, exchanged perhaps 50 words total. He was as much a mystery now as the day he'd arrived. "Can I help you?" she finally asked, proud of how steady her voice came out. Boone's gray eyes studied her face, reading something there, measuring. "They coming back?" His voice was rough from disuse, like gravel scraping stone. Evelyn understood immediately what he meant. "Next week, 1st of the month. That's collection day." "All of them?" "Usually Ortega and Finn, sometimes Sutton. Dorian comes if someone refuses to pay." She paused. "Why?" Boone didn't answer, just stood there, and Evelyn realized with a cold jolt what she was looking at. This wasn't a man asking questions. This was a man confirming details, planning. "You can't fight them alone," she said quietly. "There's 8 of them. They'll kill you. Maybe. Not maybe. They will. And then what? Town goes back to how it was. Except now we've got one more grave and Dorian's twice as mean." She stood up, walked closer. Close enough to see the burns on his hands, the exhaustion in his face, the absolute absence of fear in his eyes. "If you're doing this because of what happened to me, not just you, then why?" Boone looked at her for another long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because somebody has to." He turned and walked away before she could respond. Evelyn stood in her doorway, heart hammering, watching him cross back to his forge. The hammer caught the sunlight, black metal gleaming. Around her, the town was stirring with whispers and speculation, but all she could think was that she'd just looked into the eyes of a man who'd already decided to die. And for reasons she didn't fully understand, that terrified her more than anything Dorian Ryder had done. Inside the boarding house, Finn was just waking up with a headache that felt like somebody driving railroad spikes through his skull. Too much whiskey last night. Too many hands of cards. He'd lost $40 to Sutton, which meant he'd have to shake down a few more shops this week to make it back. He stumbled downstairs toward the kitchen, hoping Clara had coffee ready. The old woman usually did, scared as she was of what they'd do if she didn't keep them fed and comfortable. Ortega was already sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle with the kind of care most men reserve for lovers. The older man looked up as Finn entered, one eyebrow raised. "You look like hell." "Feel worse." Finn poured coffee with shaking hands. "What time is it?" "Past 9. You slept through breakfast. Dorian up yet?" "Left an hour ago. Rode out to the Hutchinson Ranch to have a conversation about their outstanding balance." Ortega went back to his rifle. "Should be back by noon." Finn sipped his coffee and tried to remember why he'd ever thought this life was glamorous. When he joined the gang 2 years ago, it had seemed like the answer to everything: money, respect, freedom from the grinding poverty of farm life. Nobody telling him what to do, nobody treating him like he was nothing. But lately, the shine had worn off. The money was good, sure, but they moved too much, never staying anywhere long enough to matter. And the things they did, the shopkeepers they terrorized, the women they humiliated, the men they beat down, it was getting harder to pretend any of it meant something. "You ever think about going straight?" Finn asked suddenly. Ortega paused mid-stroke on the rifle barrel. "What?" "Getting out. Settling down somewhere. Maybe ranching. Something that doesn't involve pointing guns at people." The older man set down his cleaning cloth. His dark eyes were unreadable. "You having doubts?" "Just asking. Because if you're having doubts, you should leave now, before Dorian notices. Man like that, he smells weakness like blood in the water, and he don't let people leave gentle." Finn had seen that firsthand. A man named Carson had tried to quit 6 months back, said he wanted to go back to his family in Kansas. Dorian had smiled and nodded and wished him well. 3 days later, they'd found Carson face down in a creek with his throat cut. Message received. "I'm not going anywhere," Finn said, though his coffee suddenly tasted bitter. "Was just making conversation." "Then here's some advice. Stop thinking. Thinking gets you killed in this business. You do what Dorian says, take your cut, and don't ask questions about the future. That's how you survive." Before Finn could respond, the front door slammed open hard enough to rattle the windows. Sutton stood in the doorway, breathing hard, eyes wide. "We got a problem." Ortega was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "What kind of problem?" "The blacksmith. He's outside, just standing there, holding some kind of—" Sutton struggled for words. "Some kind of hammer. Big one. And he's got this look, Ortega, like he's waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" "For us, I think." The 3 of them moved to the window. Sure enough, Boone Mercer stood in the street, maybe 30 yards from the boarding house. He'd moved since his earlier reconnaissance, taken up position in the center of the intersection where 4 streets met. The hammer rested on the ground beside him, his hand loose on the handle. He wasn't doing anything threatening, wasn't shouting or waving the weapon, just standing there in the sun, waiting. But something about his posture, the absolute stillness, the patience, made Finn's stomach clench. The hell is this? Sutton muttered. Ortega studied the blacksmith for a long moment, his expression darkening. This is a man looking to die. So we help him out? Not yet. Wake the others, get them armed. Nobody goes out there alone. Ortega's jaw tightened. And somebody ride fast to find Dorian. He's going to want to handle this himself. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Word spread through Red Hollow faster than fire. The blacksmith was in the street, armed, waiting. People appeared in doorways and windows, drawn by that terrible human need to witness disaster. Nobody came close. They'd learned that lesson, but they watched from safe distances, whispering speculation and dread. Evelyn stood at her shop door, hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood. She wanted to scream at Boone to run, to hide, to abandon this suicide mission before it was too late. But she knew he wouldn't listen. Men like him never did. Pete Henderson watched from behind his store window, his wife beside him. Should we do something? Like what? I don't know. Help him somehow? Agnes laughed, sharp and bitter. Help him? Pete, we can't even help ourselves. That man's about to die, and we're all going to watch it happen just like we watched everything else happen in this town, because that's what we do. That's all we do. The truth of it sat between them like poison. Inside the boarding house, the Ryder gang was gearing up for violence. Sutton checked his rifle, feeding cartridges into the magazine with practiced ease. Finn strapped on his gun belt, fingers fumbling with the buckle. 3 other gang members, a quiet killer named Drake, a half-breed called Cherokee Joe, and a youngster barely 18 named Tommy, were doing the same. Only Ortega seemed calm, sitting at the table with his rifle across his knees, waiting. He's just one man, Sutton said, trying to convince himself. What's he going to do against 6 of us? Die, Ortega said simply. Question is how many of us he takes with him. You think he's that good? I think a man who builds a weapon and then stands in the street waiting to use it has already made peace with death. That makes him dangerous. Finn's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd killed men before, 3, in the 2 years he'd ridden with the gang. But always in robberies, always with the element of surprise, always with overwhelming numbers. This felt different. This felt like walking into an ambush even though the ambush was standing right there in plain sight. Where the hell is Dorian? Drake muttered, peering through the curtain. He should be back by now. He'll be here. Ortega stood, slinging his rifle. But we can't wait. That man out there is calling us out. We don't respond. We look weak. And if we look weak, this whole town gets ideas. He was right. Red Hollow was watching, waiting to see if the Ryder gang could be challenged. If one man with a hammer could stand against them and live, it would crack the foundation of fear they'd built. Other people might find courage, might refuse to pay, might fight back. That couldn't happen. Finn, Tommy, you 2 go around back, come up the side street, get on the rooftops if you can. Crossfire. Ortega's voice was all business now. Drake, Cherokee, you go out the front with me and Sutton. Spread out wide. Keep at least 10 feet between each man. He can't swing that hammer at all of us at once. What if he's got a gun too? Tommy's voice cracked on the question. Then you shoot first and shoot straight. Ortega headed toward the door. And remember, this is just some blacksmith with delusions. We faced down actual gunfighters and walked away. This should be easy. But nobody looked like they believed that. Boone watched them emerge through the gaps in the buildings, 2 men circling around to his flanks, 4 more coming straight at him, spreading out like they'd done this before. Good tactics, professional. They'd done this before. That confirmed what he'd suspected from the start. The Ryder gang wasn't just opportunistic bandits hitting frontier towns for protection money. These were trained men, probably former soldiers or lawmen turned bad, the kind who knew how to kill efficiently and without hesitation, which meant this was going to be harder than he'd hoped. But Boone had fought trained men before, had been a trained man himself once, back when he wore a different face and answered to different names. The muscle memory was still there, buried under 5 years of horseshoes and plow repairs, waiting. His right hand tightened on the hammer handle. The weight felt good, familiar. The balance was perfect. He'd spent 3 days making sure of that. The head was solid iron, 22 pounds of concentrated force. The handle was oak, seasoned and strong, wrapped at the grip with leather strips for traction. It wasn't subtle, but subtle wasn't the point. Ortega stepped forward from the group, rifle held loosely across his chest. He stopped maybe 20 yards out. Close enough to talk, far enough to not be immediately threatening. "You're making a mistake, Blacksmith." Boone said nothing. "Whatever you think you're proving, it's not worth dying for. Put down the hammer. Walk away. Nobody has to get hurt today." Still nothing. Ortega's jaw tightened. "I don't know your story. Don't know what made you think this was a good idea. But I've been doing this a long time, and I can tell you how it ends. You swing that hammer, we shoot you. Simple as that. Maybe you get one of us. Probably Finn. He's the youngest and slowest. But the rest of us put 6 bullets in you before you take a second step. Then we drag your body down the street to remind everyone what happens to heroes." The words hung in the hot air. Boone's expression didn't change. But his left hand came up, slow and deliberate, and he pointed, not at Ortega, but at Finn, positioned 15 feet to the older man's right. Then he pointed at Sutton, at Drake, at Cherokee Joe, counting, marking targets. "You arrogant son of a—" Sutton started to raise his rifle. "Wait!" Ortega's command cracked like a whip. "Not yet. Dorian should be here. He'll want—" The hammer moved. Nobody saw it coming because nobody believed a man could move that fast carrying that much weight. One moment Boone was standing still. The next he was launching forward, hammer swinging up and around in a brutal arc aimed straight at Sutton's center mass. Sutton tried to bring his rifle up. Too slow. The hammer caught him in the ribs with a sound like kindling snapping. The big man flew backward 6 feet and hit the dirt hard, gasping, rifle skittering away. "Shoot him!" Ortega was already firing, levering rounds through his rifle as fast as he could work the action. But Boone was moving. Not running. He was too heavy for that, too weighted down by the hammer. But he moved with terrible purpose, using Sutton's falling body as cover, then shifting toward Cherokee Joe, who was still trying to process what he'd just seen. Cherokee got his gun up, got off one shot that went wide. Then Boone was inside his guard, and the hammer came down vertical, crunching into Cherokee's shoulder. The half-breed screamed and dropped, his gun arm useless. Drake fired. The bullet caught Boone high on the left shoulder, spinning him half around. Blood sprayed. But Boone kept moving, kept swinging, the hammer coming around in a horizontal sweep that caught Drake's rifle and tore it from his hands. Drake scrambled backward, fumbling for his pistol. Boone's fist, just his fist, not even the hammer, caught Drake across the jaw. The man's head snapped back and he went down in a heap. Ortega was reloading, fingers flying through the motion, cursing. Finn finally got his wits together and fired from the side, 3 quick shots that all missed as Boone kept moving, unpredictable, using the fallen men in the buildings for cover. A bullet clipped Boone's leg. He stumbled but didn't fall. His left shoulder was bleeding heavily now, the shirt dark and wet. But his right arm, the hammer arm, stayed strong. He charged Ortega. The older man got his rifle up, fired once, twice. Both shots hit, one in Boone's side, one grazing his neck. But momentum carried the blacksmith forward, and the hammer swung in a rising uppercut that caught the rifle stock and shattered it into splinters. Ortega tried to draw his pistol. Boone's offhand caught his wrist, twisted. Bones snapped like dry sticks. Ortega screamed and Boone threw him, just picked him up and threw him, into the wall of the boarding house hard enough to crack boards. Finn was running now. Not away, toward. Firing his pistol as he came, shouting incoherently. Everything they'd taught him about tactics forgotten in pure panic. His gun clicked empty. He kept pulling the trigger anyway, the hammer falling on spent cartridges, his mind refusing to accept what was happening. Boone turned to face him. The blacksmith was covered in blood, his own and others, standing in the middle of the street surrounded by fallen men, hammer hanging loose at his side. Their eyes met. Finn saw something there that froze him in place. Not rage, not hate. Just a terrible, bottomless exhaustion. The look of a man who'd killed before. Who'd killed so many times he'd lost count. Who was so tired of killing but couldn't seem to stop because the world kept demanding it. "Run," Boone said quietly. Finn ran. He dropped his gun and sprinted down the street like all the demons of hell were behind him, not looking back, not slowing down until he was 3 blocks away and vomiting in an alley from pure terror. Behind him, the street was silent except for the moaning of wounded men. Boone stood in the center of the carnage, breathing hard, bleeding from at least 4 wounds. His shoulder was on fire. His leg threatened to buckle. The hammer felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds now, and his vision was starting to blur at the edges. But he was still standing, 5 men down. 1 ran away. That left. Well, that was impressive. The voice came from the far end of the street. Dorian Ryder sat on his horse, hands crossed on the saddle horn, watching with the detached interest of a man studying a painting. He must have ridden up during the fight, must have watched the whole thing, and chosen not to intervene. Now he dismounted slowly, deliberately, his long black coat settling around him. I underestimated you, Mr. Mercer. Mr. Mercer. Boone Mercer, yes, the blacksmith. The quiet man who keeps to himself. Dorian walked forward, his hand nowhere near his gun. See, that was my mistake. I assumed quiet meant weak, assumed a man working a forge was just a tradesman. But you're something else entirely, aren't you? Boone said nothing, just shifted his stance slightly, trying to keep weight off his wounded leg. Military training, I'd say. Probably special unit of some kind. The way you moved, the target prioritization, that's not something you learn shoeing horses. Dorian stopped maybe 15 feet away. Which raises an interesting question. What's a man like you doing hiding in a nothing town like Red Hollow? What are you running from? Same thing you are. That made Dorian smile. Fair point. We're all running from something out here. But here's the difference between you and me, Mr. Mercer. I accepted what I am, embraced it, built a life around it. You? He gestured at the bleeding, exhausted blacksmith. You tried to bury it, pretend you were something different. How's that working out? Boone's grip tightened on the hammer. You've made your point, Dorian continued. Shown the town you're not to be trifled with. Very impressive. But now what? You've got maybe 5 minutes before you pass out from blood loss. My men will recover. And He patted the silver-plated pistol at his hip. I'm very, very good with this. So let's be practical. You limp back to your forge. We ride out tomorrow. Nobody else needs to die today. Sound fair? For a moment, Boone almost considered it. Every part of his body screamed at him to accept, to survive, to fight another day when the odds weren't quite so stacked. But then he thought about Evelyn standing in the street in her torn dress, thought about the town watching from windows, too scared to help, thought about 5 years of trying to be someone other than what he was, and how easily it had all fallen apart the moment violence came calling. Some men couldn't escape what they were, no matter how hard they tried. No, Boone said. Dorian's smile vanished. Then you're a fool. His hand flashed to his gun. Fast, faster than Boone had expected. The pistol cleared leather in a silver blur, barrel coming up, hammer cocking back. Boone threw the hammer, not a swing, a throw. Underhand, putting everything he had left into the motion. 22 pounds of blackened iron spinning end over end across 15 feet of dusty street. Dorian fired. The bullet caught Boone in the chest, high and right, punching through muscle. But the hammer was already in flight, and momentum cared nothing for bullets. It hit Dorian in the center of his torso with devastating force. The gang leader flew backward like he'd been kicked by a mule. His back hit the ground and the air exploded from his lungs in a shocked gasp. The silver pistol spun away into the dirt. Boone took 3 steps forward and collapsed. The street was silent except for the sound of 2 men trying to breathe. Boone lay on his side, blood pooling beneath him, vision tunneling. He could see Dorian maybe 10 feet away, also down, clutching his ribs, his face twisted in pain and shock. Neither of them was getting up anytime soon. Around them, Red Hollow held its breath. Watching. Waiting to see who would rise first, because whoever stood up would decide what happened next, would decide if this town lived free or stayed enslaved. Evelyn made the decision for them. She walked out of her shop carrying Thomas's old rifle, the one she'd kept oiled and loaded in the corner for 3 years, swearing she'd never need it. Her hands shook as she crossed the street, but her stride never wavered. She walked past Boone without looking down, walked straight to where Dorian lay gasping, and leveled the rifle at his head. Don't, Dorian wheezed, blood flecked his lips. You're not a killer, I can see it in your face. You're just a seamstress, a widow. You don't have it in you to... Evelyn pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The shot echoed off the canyon walls, rolling away into silence. She stood there for a moment, the smoking gun in her hands, staring down at what she'd done. Then she turned and walked back toward her shop, passing Sheriff Hutchins, who'd finally found the courage to emerge from his office now that the danger was over. Evelyn, Dale started. Get the doctor, she said flatly. For Mr. Mercer. Now. Then she was gone, Door closing behind her, leaving Dale standing in a street full of blood and bodies, finally forced to do his job. The sun climbed higher, the heat pressed down, and Red Hollow began to understand that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power. The old rules didn't apply anymore. Dr. Emmett Walters had been drunk when they came for him. Not falling down drunk, just the steady maintenance drinking he'd perfected over 15 years of frontier medicine, enough to keep his hands from shaking when he had to dig bullets out of screaming men, but not so much that he couldn't tell a liver from a kidney. When Pete Henderson burst into his office shouting about bodies in the street, Emmett had seriously considered another drink instead. But professional obligation was a hard habit to break, even for a man who'd mostly given up on the concept of helping people. Now he knelt in the dust beside Boone Mercer's unconscious form, his medical bag open, trying to assess the damage while half the town crowded around gawking like it was a county fair exhibition. "Back up," he snapped. "Give me room to work or get the hell away." The crowd shuffled back maybe 2 feet. Not nearly enough, but better than nothing. Emmett cut away Boone's shirt with scissors, exposing the wounds. 4 bullet holes he could see immediately: shoulder, side, leg, chest. The chest wound was the bad one, high on the right side, maybe 2 inches below the collarbone. Blood bubbled with each shallow breath, which meant lung involvement. Not immediately fatal, but damn close. "We need to move him," Emmett said. "Can't do this in the street. Too much dirt, too much contamination." "Move him where?" Pete asked. "Your office?" "Too far. He'll bleed out before we get there." Emmett looked around, thinking fast through the whiskey fog. "The boarding house, it's right there, and it's got beds." "That's where the gang was staying," Martha Simmons said, like maybe Emmett had forgotten the context of the situation. "Then it's vacant now, isn't it? Unless you want to carry a dying man 3 blocks in this heat." Emmett was already packing gauze against the chest wound, trying to slow the bleeding. "I need 4 strong men. Careful, don't jostle him more than necessary." Nobody moved. Emmett looked up at the circle of faces. People he'd treated over the years, delivered their babies, set their broken bones, held their hands while loved ones died. Respectable citizens of Red Hollow who apparently couldn't manage basic human decency when it required even minimal courage. "I'll help." Evelyn pushed through the crowd, her dress still dusty from the street, the rifle she'd used nowhere in sight. Her face was pale, but composed, like she'd made some internal calculation and come out the other side with perfect clarity about what needed doing. "You just killed a man," Pete said, stating the obvious because that's what Pete did. "Then one more stain on my conscience won't make much difference. Anyone else?" The barber stepped forward. His name was Coleman, a slight man with careful hands who'd probably never lifted anything heavier than scissors. But he nodded at Evelyn and said, "I'll help." Then the feed store owner. Then, reluctantly, Pete himself. They carried Boone like he was made of glass, which at this point wasn't far from the truth. Every movement brought fresh blood seeping through the gauze. By the time they got him up the boarding house stairs and onto a bed in the largest room, Emmett's shirt was soaked red and his hands were shaking, though whether from whiskey withdrawal or the sheer weight of responsibility, he couldn't say. "Everyone out except Evelyn," Emmett ordered. "I need someone who won't faint at the sight of blood, and she's already proven herself today." The men fled gratefully, leaving Evelyn standing by the door, hands clasped in front of her. "You know anything about medicine?" Emmett asked, pulling instruments from his bag. "I can sew." "Close enough. Wash your hands in that basin, then get over here." The next 3 hours existed in a haze of blood and pain and desperate improvisation. Emmett dug out 3 of the bullets. The 4th, the one in Boone's chest, was lodged too deep, pressed against a rib. Going after it would kill him faster than leaving it in. "Leave it?" Evelyn asked, reading his hesitation. "For now. If he survives the next day, maybe I can try again when he's stronger." Emmett packed the wound with clean cloth, his fingers working for muscle memory. If the lung doesn't collapse and infection doesn't set in, he's got maybe a 30% chance. And if those things do happen, then we'll be digging another grave tomorrow. Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, just kept handing him instruments when he needed them, holding pressure where he directed, never flinching even when Boone's body convulsed from pain despite his unconscious state. When it was finally done, Emmett sat back on the floor exhausted and let himself look at what they'd accomplished. Boone lay on the bed, his massive chest wrapped in bandages, face pale as paper, breathing shallow and rapid. Alive. Barely. The kind of barely that could tip either direction with the slightest breeze. He's strong, Emmett said, more to himself than Evelyn. Strongest constitution I've seen in years. That might be enough. What does he need now? Rest. Water if he wakes up. Watch for fever. That's the real killer. If his forehead gets hot, come get me immediately. Emmett hauled himself to his feet, every joint protesting. And pray if you're the praying type, though I suspect prayers don't carry much weight in Red Hollow anymore. He left her there, alone with the unconscious blacksmith, and went to find the bottle he'd left behind in his office. Outside, the town was dealing with its own aftermath. Sheriff Dale Hutchins stood in the street, staring at Dorian Ryder's body. The outlaw lay where Evelyn had shot him, his expensive black coat spread around him like wings, a neat hole in his forehead leaking onto the dust. His pale green eyes stared at nothing, finally empty of that terrible intelligence. Dale had seen dead men before, plenty of them, but this was different. This was a reckoning that couldn't be ignored or swept under a rug or blamed on natural causes. The other gang members were being dealt with. Sutton and Cherokee Joe had been taken to the doctor's office. They'd live, though Cherokee would never use his left arm right again. Drake was already awake, sitting against a wall with his hands tied, looking like he'd seen the devil himself and barely escaped. Ortega was unconscious with a broken back, which would probably kill him slowly over the next few days. Finn hadn't come back. Someone said they'd seen him riding out of town at full gallop, heading south toward the Mexico border. Tommy, the youngest, had surrendered without a fight the moment he saw what happened to his friends. He sat in Dale's jail cell now, 18 years old, and crying. "What do we do with them?" Pete Henderson asked. He'd appointed himself Dale's unofficial deputy in the last hour, which mostly meant following the sheriff around asking questions. "Hold them until the marshal comes." "When's that going to be?" "Whenever we send word and he decides to make the trip. Week, maybe 2. Dale rubbed his face. "We'll need witness statements, documentation, a proper report." "You writing all that?" "I'm the sheriff, aren't I?" The words came out bitter, because yes, he was the sheriff. Had been for 12 years. And in all that time, what had he done except collect a salary and look the other way when things got hard? The badge on his chest felt like it was burning through his shirt. "What about him?" Pete pointed at Dorian's body. "Bury him, quick, before he starts to stink in this heat." "Where?" "I don't care. The cemetery, I guess. Bar corner, away from decent folks." Dale turned away. "And Pete? Find someone to clean up this street. All this blood is drawing flies." He walked back to his office before anyone could ask him more questions, closed the door, and sat at his desk with his head in his hands. Through the window, he could see people starting to emerge from hiding, moving through the street in small clusters, talking in low voices. They looked different somehow, less beaten down, less afraid, like maybe they remembered how to stand up straight. Dale opened his desk drawer, pulled out the whiskey bottle, and stared at it for a long time. Then, with deliberate slowness, he poured it down the drain of the small sink in the corner. Every drop. The smell filled the room like ghosts leaving. If Red Hollow was going to rebuild itself, someone had to start. Might as well be the man who'd failed them worst. He pulled out a clean sheet of paper and started writing his report. The pen felt foreign in his hand, like he'd forgotten how to form letters. But the words came eventually, awkward and honest, documenting everything that had happened from the moment the Ryder gang rode into town until Evelyn Cross pulled the trigger that ended it. He didn't try to make himself look better. Didn't leave out the parts where he'd hidden in his office or pretended not to hear when people needed help. If he was going to do this right, it had to be all of it. The full accounting. Maybe that's what truth was. Not the polished version you told yourself to sleep at night, but the raw, ugly facts written down in daylight, where you couldn't pretend they were anything other than what they were. Evelyn sat beside Boone's bed as afternoon bled into evening. She'd pulled a chair close, her sewing basket in her lap, working on a shirt while she kept watch. The rhythmic motion of needle through fabric helped calm her hands, which wanted to shake whenever she thought too hard about what she'd done. She'd killed a man, shot him in the head, watched his blood spread across the dirt, felt nothing but grim satisfaction that he wouldn't hurt anyone ever again. That should bother her more than it did. Thomas would have been horrified. Her husband had been a gentleman, the kind who trapped spiders to release them outside rather than kill them. He'd believed in mercy, in second chances, in the fundamental goodness of people if you just gave them room to find it. But Thomas had never been humiliated in the street, had never felt the weight of a whole town's cowardice pressing down on him, had never understood that sometimes mercy was just another word for weakness, and weakness got you killed. Boone's breathing changed, still shallow, but with a different rhythm. Evelyn set down her sewing and leaned forward, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. Warm, but not burning. That was good. The doctor had said fever was the enemy now. "You're an idiot," she said quietly to the unconscious man. "You know that. A complete fool. Could have just paid them off like everyone else. Could have kept your head down and lived to a ripe old age making horseshoes. But no, you had to go and decide today was the day to be a hero." Boone didn't answer, which made sense given his current state. "And now what?" Evelyn continued, talking more to herself than him. "You live, you heal up, and then what? They'll come for you. Gang like that, there's always someone bigger, someone who'll want revenge. And Red Hollow can't protect you. Can't even protect itself most days." She went back to sewing, but her mind wouldn't settle. The question kept circling. Why had he done it? A man who barely spoke to anyone, who kept to himself so completely, most people forgot he existed. What made someone like that suddenly decide to fight? Maybe it was the same thing that made her pull the trigger. The moment when you realized living on your knees wasn't really living at all. When survival became less important than being able to look at yourself in the mirror without flinching. Or maybe he was just crazy. That seemed more likely. The door opened and Clara Reed, the boarding house owner, came in carrying a tray with soup and bread. She was 60-something, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the tray on the dresser. "Been up here 5 hours now." "I'm fine. Lying to yourself doesn't make it true." Clara poured water from a pitcher into a glass. "Eat. You'll need your strength for whatever comes next." Evelyn wanted to argue, but realized she was starving. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, which felt like a lifetime ago. She took the soup gratefully, letting the warmth fill her stomach. Clara looked down at Boone. "You gonna make it?" "Doctor says maybe. Emmett's a drunk, but he knows his work. If he says maybe, that's better odds than most." Clara moved to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "Town's talking about what you did. Let them talk. Some are calling you a murderer. Others are calling you brave. Nobody seems sure which you are. Does it matter?" "Not really. Dorian Ryder needed killing. That's just fact. The law would have hanged him eventually if they ever caught him, which they probably wouldn't have." Clara turned back. "But you should know, killing a man changes you, even when it's justified, even when it's necessary. Something shifts inside, and you don't ever quite fit back into the person you were before." "Speaking from experience? My husband. 20 years ago. He came at me drunk with a knife, and I shot him with the same rifle you used today. Nobody blamed me. Everyone said I did what I had to do. But I still see his face sometimes when I close my eyes. Still hear the sound the bullet made going in." Clara's voice was flat, emotionless, like she was reading from a ledger. "I'm just saying, don't expect it to sit easy. It never does." She left before Evelyn could respond. The room settled back into silence except for Boone's breathing and the occasional creak of the house settling. Evelyn finished her soup and went back to sewing, but Clara's words echoed in her head. She was right. Something had shifted. Evelyn could feel it, a fundamental change in how she moved through the world. This morning she'd been a seamstress, a widow, a woman trying to survive with what little dignity she could maintain. Now she was something else, someone who'd crossed a line most people never even approached. And the strangest part? She didn't regret it, not even a little. That probably said something about her character that Thomas would have found disturbing. But Thomas was dead, and the rules he'd lived by had died with him. This was a different world now, harder, meaner, less forgiving. You adapted or you disappeared. Evelyn had adapted. Boone woke sometime after midnight. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on the ceiling, trying to make sense of where he was. Everything hurt. A deep, grinding pain that went all the way to his bones. His chest felt like someone had packed it with hot coals. His shoulder throbbed in time with his heartbeat. He tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through him so sharp he gasped. "Don't!" Evelyn's voice came from somewhere to his right. "Doctor says you need to stay still. You've got holes in you that need time to close." Boone turned his head slowly. She sat in the chair beside the bed, sewing basket in her lap, lamp burning low on the table behind her. Her face looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, but her hand stayed steady on her work. "How long?" His voice came out as a rasp. "Since the fight? About 12 hours. You've been unconscious the whole time." She set down her sewing. "Do you want water?" He nodded, which sent another spike of pain through his skull. Evelyn poured from a pitcher and held the glass to his lips, careful, letting him sip slowly. The water tasted like salvation. "The others?" he asked when he could speak again. "Two dead. Dorian and one of his men during the fight. 3 wounded bad enough they're not going anywhere. 1 ran, 1 surrendered. Sheriff's holding them until the marshal arrives." Boone processed this. "You killed Dorian." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Good." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the night was still, except for the wind moving through the canyon, carrying the smell of dust and distance. "Why'd you do it?" Evelyn asked finally. "The real reason, not the noble one you tell yourself to feel better about it." Boone stared at the ceiling, considering whether to lie, but lying seemed pointless when you'd nearly died and were probably going to die still. Truth was a luxury of the doomed. "I was tired," he said quietly. "Tired of running. Tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. Tired of watching bad things happen and doing nothing because doing something meant becoming what I used to be." He paused, breathing carefully around the pain. "Turns out you can't outrun yourself. Eventually you have to face what you are, or it eats you alive anyway. And what are you? Dangerous, when I need to be." I noticed. Another silence, comfortable in a strange way. 2 people who'd crossed into territory most folks never visited, finding they spoke the same language there. "Thank you," Boone said, "for staying, for helping. Didn't do it for you. Did it because someone had to, and I'm apparently the only person in this town with a spine." Evelyn picked up her sewing again. "Besides, you saved us all. Least I can do is make sure you don't die from it. Might die anyway. Maybe. But not tonight. Doctor says if you make it through the next day, your odds improve significantly." She glanced at him. "So I suggest you keep breathing and stop making conversation. It's exhausting you." She was right. Already his eyes were getting heavy, his body demanding he shut down and let it focus on healing. But there was something he needed to say first. "Evelyn." "What?" "In about 3 days, someone's going to come looking for answers. Gang that size, someone always does. Could be law, could be friends of Dorian's, could be people wanting revenge." His breathing was getting labored now, words coming slower. "When they come, you need to let them take me. Don't try to protect me. Don't get in the way. Just sleep," Evelyn interrupted. "You can give me instructions on how to abandon you after you're well enough to walk. Until then, shut up and rest." Boone wanted to argue, but consciousness was already slipping away. His eyes closed and he fell back into the dark, this time with the knowledge that someone was watching over him. That shouldn't matter as much as it did. The next 2 days passed in a fever dream. Boone drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting infection and blood loss and trauma all at once. Sometimes he woke to find Evelyn beside him, changing bandages or forcing water down his throat. Sometimes it was Dr. Walters, smelling of carbolic and whiskey, checking wounds and muttering to himself. Sometimes he woke alone in the dark and wasn't sure if he was alive or dead or somewhere in between. The fever came on the second night, just like Walters had warned. Boone's temperature spiked until he was burning to the touch. Thrashing in the bed, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. He saw things that weren't there. Faces from his past, men he'd killed, battles he'd fought. Blood on his hands that wouldn't wash off no matter how hard he scrubbed. Evelyn stayed through all of it. Bathed his face with cool water. Changed the sheets when they got too soaked. Held him down when he tried to get up and fight invisible enemies. She did this alone because everyone else was too afraid or too busy rebuilding their own lives to care about one dying blacksmith. On the morning of the third day, the fever broke. Boone woke to sunlight streaming through the window and a clarity he hadn't felt since before the fight. His body still hurt, probably would for weeks, but the burning edge was gone. He felt weak as a newborn, but fundamentally present in a way he hadn't been. Evelyn sat in her usual chair, asleep finally, her head tilted back against the wall, mouth slightly open. She looked terrible, unwashed, exhausted, her dress wrinkled and stained. But she'd stayed. Through the worst of it, she'd stayed. Boone tried to sit up and managed maybe 3 inches before his body informed him in no uncertain terms that he was an idiot. He collapsed back with a grunt that woke Evelyn. She jerked awake, disoriented, then saw him looking at her and relaxed. "You're alive." "Seems like." "Fever's gone." "That's good." Doctor said that was the critical point. She stood, stretching, and Boone heard her spine pop. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot 4 times and then tried to fight 8 men with a hammer." Accurate assessment. She poured water without asking and helped him drink. "Can you eat? I've got broth." "Maybe later. Right now I just want to know what I missed." Evelyn filled him in while she worked, checking his bandages with surprising competence for someone who'd never done nursing before. The town was recovering. The gang members still alive were in custody. The marshal had been sent for but hadn't arrived yet. Business was slowly returning to normal, or at least the new normal, whatever that looked like. "And you?" Boone asked. "How are people treating you?" She was quiet for a moment, her hands pausing on the bandage. "Mixed. Some folks cross the street when they see me coming. Others nod like we're suddenly best friends. Martha Simmons hasn't spoken to me since it happened. She's convinced I'm going to hell for murder." "You think you are?" "No. I think hell is living on your knees while bad men do whatever they want. If shooting Dorian Ryder damns me, then damnation looks pretty reasonable from where I'm sitting." Boone almost smiled. "You're tougher than I gave you credit for." "I'm tough because I have to be, same as you." She finished with the bandage and stepped back. "Doctor says you can probably travel in about 2 weeks if you take it easy, which I'm guessing is your plan. Heal up and disappear before whoever comes looking finds you here. That's the smart play. And will you?" And Boone looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd become harder in the last 3 days, sharper. The softness she'd maintained as a seamstress and widow had burned away, leaving something more honest underneath. Someone who'd made a choice and owned it completely. "I don't know," he said truthfully. "Ask me again in 2 weeks." But they both knew 2 weeks might not be enough time, because on the afternoon of the 4th day, while Boone was sleeping and Evelyn was downstairs helping Clara with lunch, a rider came into town. He was young, maybe 25, with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest and the kind of clean-cut appearance that spoke of eastern cities and law schools. His horse was expensive, his clothes were expensive, and his gun looked like it had never been fired outside a target range. He rode straight to the sheriff's office and dismounted with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem his credentials couldn't solve. Sheriff Hutchins met him at the door, his own badge polished for the first time in years. "You must be Marshal Crawford," Dale said. "Got your telegram yesterday. We've been expecting you." The young marshal looked around Red Hollow with barely concealed disdain. "This the place with the gang trouble?" "Was. Situation's been resolved." "So I heard. Multiple fatalities, several wounded, one of my wanted fugitives dead. Hell of a mess." Crawford pulled out a notebook. "I'll need statements from everyone involved. Starting with you, Sheriff. Then I want to talk to this blacksmith who apparently decided to play vigilante." Dale's jaw tightened. "Boone Mercer's recovering from his wounds. He's not up for... I'll determine what he's up for." Crawford's voice had an edge that suggested he was used to being obeyed. "I've also got questions about the woman who shot Dorian Ryder. Evelyn Cross, is it?" "That's right. She under arrest? For what? Self-defense?" "For murder, Sheriff. Unless frontier justice has gotten so loose out here that you let civilians execute prisoners in the street." Crawford smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I understand things are different out west, but the law still applies, even here." Dale felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd been afraid of this. The moment when the official law showed up and decided to make examples out of the people who'd actually solved the problem. Because that's how it worked when you didn't have power or connections or friends in high places. You saved yourself, and then they punished you for it. "I'd like to see my prisoners now," Crawford said, "and then we'll start taking statements. This should all be wrapped up in a few days, and I can get back to civilization." He walked past Dale into the office like he owned it, already flipping through his notebook, making judgments about people he'd never met and situations he didn't understand. And Dale, standing in the doorway of his own office, realized that the fight for Red Hollow wasn't over. It had just entered a new phase, one that might be even more dangerous than the Ryder Gang ever was. Marshal Crawford spent the first hour reviewing the prisoners with the kind of methodical precision that made Dale's teeth ache. He examined Drake's split lip and asked detailed questions about how he'd received it. He watched Ortega lying on a cot in the corner, paralyzed from the waist down, and took notes about the nature of his injuries. He interviewed young Tommy through the bars, and the kid sobbed through the whole thing, saying he never wanted to hurt nobody. He just needed the money. Crawford wrote it all down without expression. "Where's the fifth man?" he asked finally. "Your report mentioned 6 gang members survived the initial confrontation." "Finn ran," Dale said. "Headed south, probably into Mexico by now." "And you didn't pursue?" "Wasn't exactly in a position to chase anyone at the time, Marshal. We had 4 wounded men, 2 dead bodies, and a town full of terrified people. Priorities." Crawford made another note. His handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. "We'll issue a warrant. If he surfaces, someone will grab him." He closed the notebook. "Now I want to talk to the blacksmith. Where is he?" "Boarding house, 2nd floor. But Marshal, the man's barely conscious. Doctor says—" "I don't care what the doctor says, Sheriff. I need his statement while events are still fresh. Memory has a way of changing to suit a narrative, and I want facts." Crawford was already moving toward the door. "Show me." Dale had no choice but to follow, feeling like a prisoner being led to his own execution. They walked through town in the late afternoon heat, boots kicking up dust with each step. People watched from windows and doorways, their expressions wary. Word had spread fast about the marshal's arrival, and nobody seemed particularly happy about it. Crawford noticed but didn't comment, his face locked in that neutral expression lawmen wore when they were making judgments about everything around them. At the boarding house, Clara met them at the door with her arms crossed. "He's not up for visitors." "I'm not a visitor, ma'am. I'm a United States Marshal conducting an official investigation." Crawford's tone suggested this should be the end of the conversation. Clara didn't budge. "Don't care if you're the president himself. Man upstairs is recovering from multiple gunshot wounds and barely survived a fever that should have killed him. You want to interview him, you come back in a week when he can actually string together a coherent sentence." "Ma'am, I can have you arrested for obstruction." "Then arrest me, but you're still not going up those stairs." Crawford's jaw tightened. Dale almost smiled despite himself. Clara Reed had been running this boarding house for 30 years, and she'd dealt with worse than some baby-faced marshal who thought his badge gave him authority over common sense. "Perhaps we could compromise," Dale suggested. "Let the marshal see that Mr. Mercer is indeed in no condition to be interviewed, and he can come back when the doctor clears him." Crawford looked like he wanted to argue, but realized he wasn't going to win this one. "Fine, but I'm going up there myself to assess his condition." Clara stepped aside with obvious reluctance. "Room at the end of the hall, and if you wake him up, I'll have your badge. I've got friends in Santa Fe who don't appreciate city marshals harassing frontier towns." Whether that was true or just a well-executed bluff, Crawford couldn't tell. But he climbed the stairs a little less confidently than he'd entered. The door to Boone's room was open. Evelyn sat in her usual chair, sewing, while Boone slept in the bed. She looked up as they entered, her expression cooling the moment she saw Crawford's badge. "Help you, gentlemen?" "Marshal Crawford, I need to speak with Mr. Mercer." "He's asleep." "Then wake him." Evelyn set down her sewing with deliberate slowness. "No." "Excuse me?" "You heard me. He's been awake maybe 6 hours total in the last 4 days. His body is trying to heal from injuries that should have killed him. You want to interrogate him about saving this town's life? You can wait until he's actually capable of answering questions without passing out." Crawford's face flushed. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. A man is dead. Multiple men are wounded. There are legal questions about the use of force, about whether what? Whether he was justified in defending himself against 8 armed outlaws?" Evelyn stood, and though she was half Crawford's size, she somehow made him take a step back. "Let me ask you something, Marshal. Where were you when the Ryder Gang was terrorizing this town? Where was the law when they were extorting money and threatening families? when they humiliated me in the street while the whole town watched. I wasn't notified until— Exactly. You weren't here. None of the law was here. We were on our own, and when someone finally did something about it, now you show up with your notebook asking questions about whether he had the right to defend us. She moved closer. That man in that bed did more for justice in one day than the law has done for Red Hollow in 10 years. So forgive me if I'm not particularly interested in helping you build a case against him. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Dale watched Crawford's face cycle through several emotions: anger, embarrassment, defensive pride, before landing on something that might have been grudging respect. I'm not trying to persecute him, ma'am. I'm trying to understand what happened so I can file an accurate report. The law required you to protect us in the first place, Evelyn interrupted. You failed. He didn't. Remember that when you're writing your report. She sat back down and picked up her sewing, effectively dismissing them both. Crawford stood there for another moment, clearly trying to decide if he should push the issue. But even he could see this was a losing battle. He glanced at Boone's sleeping form, the bandages, the pallor, the shallow breathing, and seemed to make a calculation. I'll return tomorrow, he said finally, when he's awake. Make it 3 days, Evelyn said without looking up. And bring the doctor with you so he can confirm Mr. Mercer is fit for questioning. Crawford left without another word. Dale followed him down the stairs and back out into the street, where the marshal stopped and took a long breath. That woman just threatened a federal officer, he said, though he didn't sound particularly upset about it. She's had a rough week. I can see that. Crawford pulled out his notebook again. What's her story? Widow, seamstress. Kept to herself mostly until Dorian Ryder decided to make an example of her. They tore up her shop, humiliated her publicly, threatened worse if she didn't pay protection money she didn't have. Dale paused. She's the one who shot Ryder in the head after the blacksmith took down the rest of the gang. Execution style? Self-defense style. Ryder was still moving, still dangerous. She made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. Crawford made notes. I'll need to interview her as well. Good luck with that. They walked back toward the sheriff's office in silence. Dale could feel the marshal working through things, trying to fit what he'd seen into whatever preconceptions he'd arrived with. Crawford struck him as the kind of lawman who believed in rules and procedures and proper protocol. All the things that worked great in cities, and completely fell apart the moment you got west of the Mississippi. Off the record, Crawford said finally. What really happened here? Dale considered lying, or at least shading the truth into something that sounded more official. But he'd spent the last 4 days writing the most honest report of his career, and he wasn't about to stop now. We got invaded by a gang that was smarter and meaner than usual. They set up a protection racket and made it clear anyone who didn't pay would regret it. I folded like wet paper. So did most of the town. We were scared, and we acted like cowards. He kept his eyes forward, not wanting to see Crawford's judgment. Then they went after the seamstress because she was the only one with enough spine to say no. Beat her down in the street while all of us watched. And the blacksmith, who'd spent 5 years keeping to himself, never causing a moment of trouble, apparently decided that was the line. So he locked himself in his forge for 3 days and made that hammer you saw mentioned in the report, and then he walked out and tore through 6 armed men like they were made of paper. And the seamstress shot their leader. After he'd been knocked down. After he'd lost. She walked out of her shop with a rifle and finished what the blacksmith started. Dale finally looked at Crawford. Was it legal? Probably not according to whatever books they teach you from back east. Was it justice? Damn right it was. And if you're planning to arrest either of them for it, you're going to have a problem with this entire town. Crawford was quiet for a long moment, staring at something in the middle distance. How many people did Dorian Ryder kill in his career? Wanted posters say at least 14 confirmed. Probably twice that in reality. And the Ryder gang as a whole? Combined, 50, 60, maybe more. They'd been operating for 3 years across 4 territories. So by removing them, your blacksmith and seamstress potentially saved how many lives? Dale hadn't thought about it that way. Hard to say. Dozens? Hundreds? Crawford nodded slowly, like he was working through some internal calculation. I'm going to need those 3 days to interview the prisoners and gather statements from the town. During that time, I'd appreciate it if you'd keep me informed of Mr. Mercer's condition. When he's well enough to talk, we'll have a conversation. Until then, he tucked away his notebook. Until then, I'm going to assume everyone acted in the best interests of public safety given the circumstances they faced. It wasn't quite an absolution, but it was close enough. Thank you, Marshal. Don't thank me yet. I still need to file a report, and my superiors aren't always as understanding as I am, but I'll do what I can to make sure the truth gets documented properly. Crawford glanced back toward the boarding house. That woman up there? She married? Widow, like I said. Shame. Woman with that much fire deserves someone who can match it. He tipped his hat. I'll be at the hotel if you need me. Tomorrow, I'll start talking to the townspeople. Dale watched him walk away, feeling something that might have been hope. Maybe all lawmen weren't useless. Maybe some of them actually understood that the world was complicated and messy and didn't fit neatly into whatever guidelines they learned at Academy. Or maybe Crawford was just smart enough to recognize when pushing would create more problems than it solved. Either way, Red Hollow had caught a break. The question was whether that break would last. Over the next 3 days, Marshal Crawford conducted his interviews with the kind of thoroughness that made people uncomfortable. He talked to Pete Henderson and Agnes. He talked to Martha Simmons and Coleman the barber. He talked to Clara Reed, Dr. Walters, and at least 20 other townspeople who'd witnessed various parts of what happened. The story that emerged was consistent. The Ryder gang had terrorized Red Hollow, the law had been absent, and 2 people had finally done something about it when everyone else was too scared. But Crawford also uncovered details that Dale's report had glossed over, like how several townspeople had actively turned away when Evelyn tried to borrow money, knowing what would happen to her. Like how the sheriff's office had remained locked during the actual fight. Like how Red Hollow had been perfectly willing to let Evelyn and Boone die as long as it meant the rest of them stayed safe. Those details didn't paint a flattering picture of frontier courage. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Crawford knocked on the door of Boone's room. Evelyn answered, looking marginally less exhausted than she had during their first encounter. "He awake?" Crawford asked. "And coherent. Dr. Walters is with him now." Crawford entered to find Boone sitting up in bed for the first time, propped against pillows, his chest still wrapped in bandages, but his color significantly better. Walters was checking his pulse, counting silently. "Blood pressure's stabilizing," the doctor said. "Fever's been gone for 2 days. Wounds are closing clean. No signs of infection." He stepped back. "You're lucky as hell, Mr. Mercer. By all rights, you should be dead." "Feel like I am sometimes," Boone said, his voice rough but stronger than it had been. Walters packed his bag. "I'll check on you tomorrow. Try not to move around too much. Those stitches won't hold if you go picking fights." He nodded to Crawford. "He's all yours, Marshal, but keep it short. He still needs rest." After Walters left, Crawford pulled up the chair Evelyn had occupied for days. She stayed by the window, watching but saying nothing. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Marshal Crawford. I need to ask you some questions about what happened with the Ryder gang." Boone studied him with those flat gray eyes. "What do you want to know?" "Let's start with why. You'd lived here 5 years without incident. What made you decide to confront 8 armed men alone?" "Wasn't going to be more than one chance. If I waited, they'd have dug in deeper, harder to remove." Boone shifted slightly, wincing. And they'd already shown what they were willing to do. Waiting meant more people would get hurt. "So you took it upon yourself to act as judge, jury, and executioner?" "I took it upon myself to defend people who couldn't defend themselves." "That a crime?" "Depends on the circumstances." "Did you attempt any other solutions first? Did you try talking to them, negotiating, finding a peaceful resolution?" "You try negotiating with a man who humiliates women in the street for entertainment? Let me know how that works out for you." Crawford made notes. "The violence you used was extreme. Multiple broken bones, severe trauma. You killed at least 1 man during the fight. Cherokee Joe died from his wounds yesterday." Boone's expression didn't change. "Should have stayed home that day." "That's remarkably cold." "It's realistic. He chose to ride with Dorian Ryder, chose to terrorize towns, chose to put himself in a position where someone might fight back. I didn't hunt him down. He came to me. I just finished what he started." Crawford leaned back, studying Boone. "You have military training. That's obvious from how you fought. Where'd you serve?" "That relevant to your investigation?" "It might be. I'm trying to understand what kind of man takes on 8 outlaws with a blacksmith's hammer and actually wins." The room was quiet except for the sound of wind outside and the distant noises of the town going about its business. "I served," Boone said finally, "during the war and after. Did things I'm not proud of. When it ended, I wanted to be something else. Somewhere quiet where I could work with my hands and not have to hurt people anymore. He looked directly at Crawford. But wanting something and getting it are different things. Turns out you can't run from what you are. You can hide for a while, but eventually something happens that makes you choose. Let bad things happen or become what you were trying to escape. And you chose violence. I chose to stop worse violence. That's not the same thing. Crawford made more notes, his pen scratching across the page. What about Evelyn Cross? You coordinated with her beforehand? No, Evelyn said from the window. I didn't even know what he was planning until it happened. But you shot Dorian Ryder after the fight was essentially over. That's harder to justify as self-defense. He was still alive, still armed, still dangerous. Evelyn's voice was calm, factual. I made sure he couldn't hurt anyone ever again. If that's murder in your book, then arrest me. But don't pretend I did anything wrong. Crawford looked between them. These two people who'd somehow decided the law wasn't coming fast enough and taken matters into their own hands. He'd seen vigilante justice before, and it usually left him uncomfortable. But there was something different here. These weren't people who enjoyed violence or sought it out. They were survivors who'd been pushed past their breaking point and fought back the only way they knew how. Here's my problem, Crawford said finally. I have a report to file. That report has to explain why multiple men are dead or wounded, why a known outlaw gang was destroyed, and why the local law enforcement was completely absent during the critical moments. He looked at Dale, who'd been standing quietly in the doorway. No offense, Sheriff. None taken. It's the truth. So I can write this one of two ways. I can call it vigilante justice, say proper procedures weren't followed, and recommend charges against both of you. That would be technically correct according to territorial law. Crawford paused. Or I can call it justifiable community defense in the absence of available law enforcement. Note that all parties acted to prevent immediate and ongoing threats to public safety, and recommend the case be closed. That would be practically correct according to common sense. Which are you going to do? Evelyn asked. The second one. On one condition. Boone's eyes narrowed. What condition? I need to know your real name, your full history. Because I looked into you, Mr. Mercer, and you know what I found? Nothing. You don't exist before you arrived in Red Hollow 5 years ago. No records, no military service documentation, no trail of any kind. For a man claiming he served in the war, you're remarkably good at hiding who you were. The silence stretched out, tight as wire. That's not part of this investigation, Boone said carefully. Maybe not legally, but I'm making it personal. Because here's what I think. I think you're running from something. I think you've got warrants somewhere, or enemies, or a past that would cause you serious problems if it came to light. And I'm willing to let that slide, willing to file a report that keeps you safe if you give me the truth. Just once, just between us. Boone looked at Evelyn. She met his eyes and gave the slightest nod. Your choice. Your secret. Your risk. He turned back to Crawford. My name is Boone Mercer. It always has been. But 20 years ago, during the war, I served in a unit that officially doesn't exist. We did the kind of work that couldn't be documented, couldn't be acknowledged, couldn't be tied back to anyone with authority. Executions, assassinations, the removal of problems that conventional forces couldn't handle. Crawford's pen had stopped moving. After the war, some of us were supposed to disappear quietly, get paid out, change our names, vanish into civilian life. But I made the mistake of having a conscience about what we'd done, talked about it when I shouldn't have. Made people nervous. Boone's voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reciting from someone else's history. They decided I was a liability, tried to eliminate me during a prison fire, made it look like an accident. I survived and ran, been running ever since. Who's they? People with enough power that you'd be smart not to ask. People who don't like loose ends. Boone met Crawford's eyes. You put my real name in any official report, those people will find it eventually, and they'll come for me, maybe for anyone associated with me. Is that really what you want to do to Red Hollow after everything this town's been through? Crawford sat very still, processing this. That's quite a story. It's the truth. You asked for truth. I did. Crawford closed his notebook. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to write a report stating that Boone Mercer, Blacksmith and longtime resident of Red Hollow, acted in defense of his community against the Ryder gang. I'm going to note that Evelyn Cross acted appropriately in a life-threatening situation. I'm going to recommend no charges be filed, and I'm going to classify certain details of Mr. Mercer's background as irrelevant to the investigation and seal them accordingly." "Why?" Evelyn asked. "Why would you do that?" "Because sometimes the law and justice point in different directions, and when that happens, you have to choose which one you actually serve." Crawford stood. "I serve justice, which means recognizing that you two did more good in one day than most people do in a lifetime, regardless of what rules got bent along the way." He headed for the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Mr. Mercer, whoever you were, whatever you did, you paid your debt here. You saved lives, protected people who couldn't protect themselves. That counts for something." After he left, the room was quiet except for breathing. "You didn't have to tell him," Evelyn said softly. "Yes, I did. Man was giving us a way out. Least I could do was respect him enough to be honest." Boone shifted in the bed, trying to get comfortable. "Besides, I'm tired of secrets, tired of pretending. Maybe it's time to just be who I am and deal with whatever comes." "And who are you?" Boone considered this. "Someone trying to be better than I was. Not always succeeding, but trying." Evelyn moved to the chair, sat down with her sewing. "That's more than most people can say." They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting everything gold. Outside, Red Hollow was rebuilding itself piece by piece, not just the physical damage, but something deeper. The town was learning what it meant to stand up, to fight back, to refuse to live on its knees. It was a hard lesson, paid for in blood and fear and shame, but some lessons only stick when they cost you something. Marshal Crawford left Red Hollow 3 days later with his report complete and his prisoners in custody. He'd arranged for a wagon to transport Drake, Sutton, and young Tommy to the territorial prison, where they'd face trial for their crimes. Ortega had died the night before, his paralyzed body finally giving up after days of fighting. The morning Crawford departed, half the town turned out to watch. Not to cheer, nobody was in a celebrating mood, but to witness. To mark the moment when official law finally acknowledged what had happened here. Crawford tipped his hat to Dale. "You did good work, Sheriff. Your report was thorough and honest. That's rarer than you'd think in my line of work." "Just wrote what happened." "Exactly." Crawford glanced toward the boarding house, where Boone was presumably still recovering. "Take care of your people, Sheriff. They've been through enough." "I will." The wagon rolled out, taking the last remnants of the rider gang with it. People watched until it was out of sight, then slowly dispersed back to their businesses and homes. Dale stood in the street for a long time after everyone else had gone, thinking about what Crawford had said. Take care of your people. Like it was that simple. Like he hadn't spent 12 years failing to do exactly that. But maybe it was time to start trying again. He unpinned the star from his chest, looked at it for a moment, then pinned it back on with deliberate care. It didn't feel like redemption. Redemption was probably beyond his reach at this point, but it felt like a beginning. That would have to be enough. Boone was sitting in a chair by the window when Evelyn came to visit that evening. He'd managed to dress himself in a clean shirt, though the effort had left him sweating and exhausted. His shoulder still throbbed and his chest felt like it was being crushed in a vice, but he was upright. That counted as progress. "You shouldn't be out of bed," Evelyn said, setting down a basket of food Claire had sent up. "Been in bed for a week. If I don't move, I'm going to forget how." She started unpacking the basket, bread, cheese, some kind of stew that smelled better than anything Boone had eaten in days. "Doctor says another week at least before you should even think about leaving this room." "Doctor's cautious." "Doctor's smart. You nearly died. Multiple times." She handed him a bowl of stew. "Eat. You need to rebuild your strength." They ate in silence, the food warm and solid, reminding Boone that he was still alive despite everything. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and orange. Beautiful, if you had the energy to appreciate it. "Town's talking," Evelyn said after a while, "about what happens next." "What do they want to happen?" "Depends who you ask. Some think you should stay, help rebuild what's broken. Others think you should leave before whoever you're running from finds you here and brings more trouble." She set down her bowl. "What do you think?" Boone had been asking himself that question for days. The smart play was obvious. Heal up, pack light, Disappear before anyone connected the dots between the blacksmith of Red Hollow and whoever he used to be. Start over somewhere new. Keep running. But he was tired of running, tired of starting over, tired of pretending to be someone he wasn't. I think, he said slowly, that I'm too old to keep moving every time something gets hard. I think this town needs someone who's willing to stand up when things go bad. And I think maybe I need to stop hiding from what I am and figure out how to use it for something other than survival. That sounds like you're staying. Sounds like it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, processing this. People are going to have expectations. They saw what you can do. They're going to think you're some kind of hero who'll solve all their problems. Then they're going to be disappointed. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who got tired of watching bad things happen. That might be the closest thing to heroism that actually exists. Boone almost smiled. What about you? You staying? Where else would I go? This is my home. My shop. My life. She paused. Besides, someone has to keep you from doing something stupid and getting yourself killed. Apparently that's my job now. Didn't ask for a keeper. Too bad. You've got one anyway. They finished eating as darkness settled over Red Hollow, the town lights beginning to flicker on one by one. It wasn't much. This little canyon settlement that most people forgot existed, but it was something. A place where people could build lives, make mistakes, try again. A place worth protecting, even if it cost you everything to do it. 2 weeks after Marshal Crawford left, Boone returned to his forge. Dr. Walters had told him to wait another week, but Boone was done waiting. His shoulder still ached, and the chest wound pulled whenever he breathed too deep. But his hands worked fine, and that's what mattered. A blacksmith who couldn't lift a hammer wasn't much of anything. The forge was exactly as he'd left it. Tools scattered across the workbench, cold ashes in the furnace, that war hammer resting on the anvil where he'd set it before walking out to face the rider gang. Dust had settled over everything like a shroud. Boone stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking. This space had been his sanctuary for 5 years. The place where he could lose himself in honest work and forget, for a few hours at a time, what he'd been. Now it felt different. Smaller somehow. Like the act of violence had changed its dimensions. Or maybe he'd just stopped pretending it was a hiding place. He lit the furnace, fed it coal until it roared to life, and started working. Not the hammer. He couldn't lift that thing yet, not properly. But there were horseshoes to make, hinges to repair, a dozen small jobs that had piled up while he was recovering. His hands remembered the motions even if his body protested. Heat and metal and the steady rhythm of work. By noon, people had started gathering outside. They didn't come in, didn't interrupt, just stood in the street watching through the open doors as the blacksmith worked. Pete Henderson. Agnes? Martha Simmons, Coleman the barber, others whose names Boone had never bothered learning. They watched like he was performing some kind of ritual, like the sight of him working proved something they needed proven, that life could go back to normal, that monsters could be beaten, that you could stand up and survive it. Around 3 o'clock, Evelyn showed up with a basket. She ignored the crowd, walked straight into the forge, and set it on the workbench. Lunch, you missed it. Not hungry. Don't care, eat anyway. She pulled out bread and cheese and an apple. And drink this. Doctor says you need fluids. Boone wanted to argue, but didn't have the energy. He set down his hammer, wiped sweat from his face, and ate. The food was good. Evelyn had gotten better at packing meals that would survive the heat, and he was hungrier than he'd realized. They're still out there, she said, nodding toward the street. I noticed. It's been like this all morning. Word spread you were back at work, and people just appeared. Like they needed to see it for themselves. See what? That you're real. That what happened actually happened. Evelyn sat on a stool watching him eat. You're a symbol now, whether you want to be or not. I'm a blacksmith. You're both. And you better get used to it because this town isn't going to let you disappear back into anonymity. Not after what you did. Boone finished the apple and tossed the core into the furnace. It caught and burned, gone in seconds. I didn't do it to be a symbol. I did it because someone had to. That's exactly why they're watching. Because you did what they couldn't. You gave them something they'd lost. The idea that one person can make a difference. That standing up matters. She paused. That's a powerful thing, Boone. Don't waste it by pretending it doesn't exist. She left before he could respond, taking the empty basket with her. The crowd stayed until sunset, then slowly dispersed. But Boone knew they'd be back. This was his life now, being watched, being measured, being held up as some kind of example of courage, when really he'd just been too tired to keep running. He worked until he couldn't lift his arms anymore, then locked up the forge and walked back to his room behind it. The space felt different too. Emptier. He'd lived here alone for 5 years without thinking much about it, but now the silence pressed down like weight. Maybe that's what happened when you stopped hiding. The walls you'd built to keep the world out suddenly felt like prison walls keeping you in. He slept badly that night, dreams full of faces he'd rather forget. The next morning, Sheriff Hutchins showed up at the forge carrying coffee and looking like he hadn't slept much either. "Got a minute?" Dale asked. Boone gestured him in. They stood by the furnace, not quite comfortable, but not quite strangers either. Two men who'd both failed in their own ways and were trying to figure out what came after failure. "Town council met last night," Dale said, staring into his coffee. "They want to hire you officially." "As what?" "Deputy, part-time, to help maintain order and handle situations that might require your particular skills." Boone almost laughed. "I'm a blacksmith, not a lawman. You're someone who can stop bad things from happening. That's close enough." Dale finally looked at him. "Look, I know I'm the last person who should be asking this. I know what I did or didn't do when the gang was here. I know I failed this town in every way that mattered, but I'm trying to do better. And part of doing better is recognizing what we need. What do you think we need? Someone people trust. Someone who proved they're willing to stand up when things get hard. Someone who makes outlaws think twice before riding through here again." Dale paused. "Someone who isn't me, at least not alone." The honesty in his voice was uncomfortable to hear. This was a man who'd looked at himself and didn't like what he saw, and was trying, maybe failing, but trying to be something different. Boone respected that more than he wanted to admit. "I'm not wearing a badge," he said finally. "Don't need you to. Just need you to be available when trouble shows up. You keep working your forge, living your life. But if something happens that the law can't handle alone, I know who to call." Dale extended his hand. $20 a month. Plus, you get to keep refusing to be sociable without anyone complaining about it. Boone looked at the offered hand for a long moment, thinking about what it meant to accept. To officially become part of this town's defense. To stop pretending he was just passing through. He shook Dale's hand. "Good," Dale said, relief evident on his face. "Now I can tell the council I actually accomplished something useful." After the sheriff left, Boone stood alone in the forge, wondering what he'd just agreed to. Deputy, part-time lawman, official town protector. All the things he'd spent 5 years avoiding, but maybe that was the point. You couldn't avoid what you were forever. Sooner or later, you had to decide. Keep running or plant roots and deal with whatever came looking. Boone had planted roots. Now he'd see if they held. Over the next month, Red Hollow began to change in ways nobody had quite anticipated. The most obvious difference was the silence. Not the scared silence of people afraid to speak, the comfortable silence of folks who didn't feel like they needed to constantly look over their shoulders. People walked straighter, made eye contact, said good morning to each other like they meant it. But there were deeper changes too. Evelyn's shop became something more than a sewing business. Women started gathering there in the afternoons, not for alterations, but for conversation, for support, for the kind of community they'd forgotten how to build when fear had isolated everyone into their own private struggles. Martha Simmons came, despite her earlier judgment about murder and hell. So did Agnes Henderson, Clara Reed, and a dozen others. They talked about everything. Their husbands, their children, their frustrations with frontier life, the things they were afraid of and the things they hoped for. And sometimes they talked about what had happened with the Ryder gang, processing it together in a way that helped the wounds close cleaner. Evelyn didn't try to lead these gatherings, didn't position herself as some kind of hero or martyr. She just sewed and listened and occasionally offered the kind of blunt honesty that came from having survived something terrible and refusing to pretend it wasn't terrible. "You shot a man," Martha said one afternoon, the words hanging in the air like an accusation that wasn't quite an accusation. "I did," Evelyn agreed, not looking up from her work. "Doesn't it haunt you?" "Every night. I see his face when I close my eyes, hear the sound the bullet made, smell the gunpowder. She paused, needle poised above fabric. But you know what haunts me more? Remembering how I felt lying in that street while everyone watched and did nothing. That's worse than anything else. So yes, I killed him, and yes, it haunts me. But I do it again because the alternative was living the rest of my life as someone who couldn't protect herself. Martha was quiet for a long time. Then, I'm sorry I didn't help you that day. I know. I was scared. We were all scared. That's what men like Dorian count on, that fear will make us weak, that we'll choose safety over standing up. Evelyn finally looked at Martha. But fear only works if you let it. The moment you decide there are things worse than being afraid, you take back your power. That's what I did. That's what Boone did. And that's what this town needs to learn if we're going to survive whatever comes next. The women absorbed this in silence. Some nodded, some looked uncomfortable. But they all kept coming back week after week, learning how to be something other than afraid. Meanwhile, the men were dealing with their own reckoning. Pete Henderson couldn't stop thinking about how he'd refused to lend Evelyn money, how he'd watched her humiliation and done nothing. The shame ate at him until he finally went to her shop one evening after everyone else had left. I need to apologize, he said from the doorway, hat in his hands. Evelyn looked up from her sewing. All right. I should have helped you, should have stood up, should have been a man instead of a coward. The words came out in a rush, like he'd been practicing them. I don't expect forgiveness. Just wanted you to know I see what I did, what I didn't do. And it's not going to happen again. What's different now? I am. Watching what you and Boone did, it made me realize I've been living small, playing it safe, telling myself that keeping my head down was wisdom, when really it was just fear wearing a respectable mask. Pete looked at her directly. I'm not a fighter like Boone, not brave like you, but I can be better than I was. Can stand up when it matters. Can help my neighbors instead of abandoning them. Evelyn set down her sewing. Then do that. Don't apologize to me. Show me. Show this town. Be the person you wish you'd been when it counted, and maybe the next time something happens, you will be. Pete left with something that felt like purpose. He wasn't the only one. Over the following weeks, Coleman the barber started offering free haircuts to families who couldn't afford them. The feed store owner began extending credit to ranchers hit hard by drought. Small acts of decency that added up to something larger. Red Hollow was learning what community actually meant. 6 weeks after the fight, a stranger rode into town. He was older, maybe 60, with white hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He wore decent clothes, nothing fancy, and rode a good horse. He didn't look threatening, but something about the deliberate way he moved made Dale nervous. The stranger dismounted outside the forge and stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of hammering inside. Then he walked in like he owned the place. Boone was shaping a horseshoe, his back to the door. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed slightly. Recognition of a presence that didn't belong. Boone Mercer, the stranger said. Not a question. A statement. Boone set down his hammer and turned. His face showed nothing, but his hands stayed loose at his sides, ready. Do I know you? Not personally, but I know who you are, or rather who you were. The stranger pulled out a worn photograph and set it on the workbench. That's you, 20 years younger, different name, different life, before you disappeared. Boone glanced at the photo. A younger version of himself in a military uniform that officially didn't exist, standing with other men whose faces he'd tried hard to forget. Where'd you get that? Doesn't matter. What matters is why I'm here. The stranger leaned against the wall, casual. My name's Garrett. I was in your unit. Different squad, same nightmare. And like you, I tried to disappear when they decided we were liabilities. You here to kill me? If I was, you'd already be dead. I'm good at my job. Garrett smiled without humor. No, I'm here because word travels. A blacksmith in a frontier town takes down an entire outlaw gang with a hammer? That story doesn't stay local. It spreads, gets embellished, eventually reaches people who pay attention to that kind of thing. Boone's jaw tightened. How long? Before they come? Hard to say. Could be months. Could be years. Could be never. You did a good job covering your tracks, and they might not make the connection. Garrett paused. But if they do come, you should be ready. Because they won't come alone, and they won't come fair. Why warn me? Because we're the same, you and me. Ghosts who were supposed to die but didn't. Survivors trying to live with what we did. And I'm tired of seeing good men get eliminated because some politician decided we knew too much. Garrett pushed off from the wall. You've built something here. Matters to people. That's more than most of us managed. I'd hate to see it destroyed because you weren't prepared. He headed for the door, then stopped. One more thing. That hammer you made? The one you used on the gang? Keep it close. Something tells me you're going to need it again. Then he was gone, riding out of Red Hollow as quietly as he'd arrived. Boone stood alone in the forge, staring at the photograph. The past he'd tried to bury stared back at him, young and dangerous and full of violence. That man felt like a stranger now. But Garrett was right. You couldn't run from what you were. Could only try to use it for something better than destruction. He took the photograph and fed it to the furnace. It caught and burned, curling into ash and smoke. But the warning remained. That night, Boone told Evelyn everything. They sat in her shop after hours, the only light coming from a single lamp, and he laid out his entire history. The war, the unit, the things they'd done that couldn't be spoken of, the attempted execution, his escape, and the years of running that followed. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When he finished, the silence stretched out long enough that Boone thought maybe he'd finally gone too far, told her something too dark to forgive. Then she said, "Are you planning to leave?" "I don't want to, but if they come, it'll put everyone here in danger. You, Dale, the whole town. Might be smarter to run again. Start over somewhere new. Keep hiding." Evelyn's voice was sharp. "For how long, Boone? How many towns do you go through before you realize there's no such thing as far enough? That eventually you have to stop and face whatever's chasing you?" "It's not that simple. It never is. But running isn't the answer. It's just slow death disguised as survival." She leaned forward. "You told me once that you were tired of watching bad things happen, that you couldn't keep pretending to be something you weren't. Well, this is who you are now. Someone who protects people. Someone who stands up. If you run, you're not protecting us. You're abandoning us. And you're abandoning yourself. If I stay and they come, people might die." "People might die anyway. That's life on the frontier. But at least if you stay, we've got a chance. If you run, we've got nothing except the memory of someone who helped us once and then disappeared the moment things got complicated." Boone wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. She was right. He knew she was right. Running wasn't protection. It was cowardice dressed up as sacrifice. "Besides," Evelyn continued, "you're not alone anymore. You've got this town. You've got Dale. You've got me. Whatever comes, we face it together. That's what community means. You don't know what these people are capable of. I know what you're capable of, and I know what I'm capable of. I killed a man, Boone, shot him in the head and walked away without looking back. If someone comes for you, they'll have to go through me first. And I promise you, that's not going to be as easy as they think." The fierceness in her voice made Boone's chest tighten. This woman who'd been a widow and a seamstress just 2 months ago, who'd survived humiliation and trauma and come out the other side stronger, she was offering to stand beside him against enemies she couldn't even imagine. That took a kind of courage that made his own violence look simple by comparison. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me. Just don't run. We need you here." "Why? Well, you're the reason we're not afraid anymore. You're the reason people walk with their heads up. You're the reason this town remembered it had a spine." She stood, walked to the window, looked out at the dark street. "You think you're just a blacksmith who got tired of watching bad things happen, but you're more than that. You're proof that one person can make a difference, that standing up matters, that violence can be answered with greater violence in the service of something good. That's a dangerous philosophy." So is pacifism when the wolves are at the door. The world isn't kind, Boone. It's not fair. And sometimes the only answer to evil is someone willing to meet it with force and refuse to back down. She turned back to him. "That's you. That's what you are. And this town needs that, whether it makes you comfortable or not." Boone sat with those words for a long moment, feeling the weight of them settle into his bones. She was asking him to be something he'd tried to leave behind, to accept that violence was part of who he was and always would be, to stop pretending he could be anything else. But maybe pretending had been the real problem all along. All right, he said. I'll stay. But if they come, we do it smart. We prepare. We plan. We don't just wait around hoping for the best. Agreed. What do you need? Time, tools, and people willing to learn how to defend themselves instead of depending on someone else to save them. Evelyn smiled. I think we can manage that. Over the next 3 months, Red Hollow transformed again. It started quietly. Boone began teaching basic self-defense to anyone interested, which turned out to be more people than expected. Twice a week, after the forge closed, men and women gathered in an empty lot and learned how to punch, how to block, how to use their body weight to throw someone larger, how to fight dirty when fighting fair would get you killed. Sheriff Hutchins organized shooting practice. Nothing fancy, just basic marksmanship and gun safety. Pete Henderson turned out to be a surprisingly good shot. So did Coleman the barber. Even Martha Simmons, after some initial reluctance, proved she could hit a target at 30 yards. Evelyn started teaching women how to hide weapons in their clothes, how to use everyday objects as defensive tools, how to recognize danger before it arrived. Her gatherings became part social club, part tactical training, the sewing circle with teeth. Red Hollow was becoming something the Ryder Gang had never anticipated, a town that wouldn't be victimized again. But the real change was subtler. It was in how people treated each other, the way neighbors helped neighbors without being asked, the way strangers were welcomed but watched carefully, the way everyone understood that safety was a communal responsibility, not something you outsourced to a sheriff or a blacksmith. They were learning to be strong together instead of weak alone. The threat Garrett had warned about never materialized. Months passed without any sign of the people from Boone's past. Maybe they hadn't made the connection. Maybe they'd decided he wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe they'd simply forgotten about him in the shuffle of newer problems. Or maybe they were just patient. Boone didn't let himself relax. Kept the warhammer in his forge, where he could reach it quickly. Kept his eyes on strangers and his ears open for trouble. But as winter came and went and spring arrived with its usual promise of renewal, he started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd found a place where he could stop running. One evening in late spring, he was closing up the forge when Evelyn appeared with a basket. This had become routine over the months, her showing up with food, them eating together, talking about nothing important. Comfortable silence punctuated by easy conversation. Town council met again, she said, unpacking dinner. What did they decide this time? They want to build a schoolhouse. Think it's time Red Hollow started looking toward the future instead of just surviving the present. She handed him bread. They're asking for donations, labor, materials, money, whatever people can spare. Good idea. Kids need education. They also voted to name it after you. Boone nearly choked on his bread. What? The Mercer School, in recognition of your service to the community. Evelyn's face was carefully neutral. I told them you'd hate it, but they voted anyway. Democracy in action. Tell them no. Too late. Already approved. Sign goes up next week. She finally smiled. You're a hero, Boone. Better get used to it. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who did what needed doing when no one else would. That's the definition of heroism. The fact that you don't see it that way is exactly why you qualify. Boone wanted to argue but knew it was pointless. The town had decided who he was, and nothing he said would change their minds. He could either accept it or spend the rest of his life being uncomfortable. He chose to accept it. Mostly. Fine, but I'm not going to any dedication ceremony. They can name it whatever they want, but I'm not standing there while people make speeches about how great I am. Fair enough. I'll let them know you're a reluctant hero who hates attention. I'm not a hero. Yes, we've established your position. Eat your dinner before it gets cold. They ate as the sun set, painting the forge in golden light. Outside, Red Hollow went about its evening routine, people heading home from work, children playing in the street, smoke rising from chimneys as families prepared their own dinners. The normal, unremarkable business of living. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. There were still disputes and petty jealousies and all the small failures that came with being human. Dale still drank occasionally, though less than before. Martha Simmons still judged people more harshly than necessary. Pete Henderson still worried too much about money. But they were trying. The whole town was trying to be better than it had been, and trying counted for something. You ever think about leaving? Evelyn asked suddenly. Every day, Boone admitted. Old habits. Part of me keeps waiting for the moment when I need to pack up and run. But you stay. I stay. Why? Boone thought about this, looking out at the town he'd somehow become part of. Because running didn't make me safe, didn't make me happy. It just made me alone, and I'm tired of being alone. Evelyn's hand found his across the table. Her grip was strong, calloused from sewing and shooting and the hard work of surviving. You're not alone anymore, she said simply. And that was true. Somewhere between the fight with the Ryder gang and now, Boone had stopped being the solitary blacksmith hiding from his past. He'd become part of something larger, a community, a family of sorts. People who knew him, really knew him, and chose to stand beside him anyway. That was worth more than safety, worth more than anonymity, worth staying for. Neither are you, he said. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over Red Hollow, hands still linked across the table, two people who'd survived their own kinds of hell and found something like peace on the other side. It wasn't a perfect ending. Real life didn't give those, but it was an honest one. And sometimes honest was the best you could hope for. Years passed, though not without their complications. The school was built, and children learned to read and write and calculate. Some of them went on to larger towns, seeking opportunities Red Hollow couldn't provide. Others stayed, raising their own families, continuing the cycle. Sheriff Hutchins served another 5 years before his heart gave out one morning while he was making coffee. He died at his desk with his badge on, which was more dignity than he'd expected. The town gave him a proper funeral and genuinely mourned. He'd earned that in the end. They offered the sheriff's position to Boone. He declined, but agreed to serve as deputy on a permanent basis. That suited everyone fine. Dale's replacement, a younger man named Morrison who'd come west looking for purpose, handled the paperwork and daily administration while Boone dealt with actual threats, which were rare. Word had spread about Red Hollow, about the town that had destroyed the Ryder gang, about the blacksmith who could take apart armed men with a hammer. Outlaws started avoiding the area entirely, finding easier targets elsewhere. That reputation saved lives, even if it sometimes felt like a curse. Evelyn kept her shop, but expanded it into something more ambitious. She started taking in girls from difficult situations, orphans, runaways, women escaping bad marriages, taught them sewing and shooting and everything else they'd need to survive on their own. Some people called it charity. Evelyn called it investment in the future. She and Boone never married, which scandalized Martha Simmons to no end, but they lived as partners in everything that mattered, sharing meals and decisions, and the quiet comfort of knowing someone had your back. Marriage was just paperwork. What they had was deeper than any certificate could make official. The threat from Boone's past never materialized. Either they'd lost his trail or decided he wasn't worth the trouble. Or maybe Garrett had been wrong and there was no threat to begin with. Boone never knew for sure and eventually stopped checking over his shoulder quite so often, though the warhammer stayed in the forge, oiled and ready, just in case. 10 years after the fight with the Ryder gang, a young bounty hunter rode into Red Hollow carrying wanted posters and questions. He was maybe 23, full of confidence and ambition, looking to make a name for himself. He asked around about Boone Mercer, wanted to know if it was true what they said about him, if the stories were exaggerated, if the blacksmith really was the same man from the old war unit that supposedly didn't exist. People told him to leave it alone, told him some questions were better unasked, told him that Boone Mercer had paid whatever debts he owed, and then some, and dragging up his past would do nothing but cause pain. The bounty hunter didn't listen. He confronted Boone at the forge one morning, poster in hand, demanding answers. Demanding Boone come with him to face questions about his service, his escape, his years of hiding. Boone looked at the poster, his face younger, his name different, the official seal marking him as wanted for questioning regarding classified operations. Then he looked at the young man holding it. "You really want to do this?" Boone asked quietly. "I'm a lawman. I don't get to pick and choose which laws I enforce." "Actually, you do. Every single day. That's the burden of wearing a badge, deciding what matters and what doesn't, what serves justice and what just serves paperwork. The law is the law. The law said slavery was legal once, said women couldn't vote, said a lot of things that turned out to be wrong." Boone set down his hammer. "You take me in, you think you're upholding the law, But what you're really doing is telling this town that standing up doesn't matter, that protecting people doesn't count, that the past is more important than what someone's done since. I have orders. Orders from people who don't live here, who don't know what happened, who don't care that this town is safer because of what I did. Boone stepped closer. So here's what you need to decide. Are you a lawman who follows orders, or are you someone who thinks about what justice actually means? Because those aren't always the same thing. The bounty hunter stood there, poster in hand, clearly struggling with the gap between what he'd been taught and what he was seeing. Around them, the town had stopped working. People watched from windows and doorways, waiting to see what would happen, ready to defend their blacksmith if it came to that. The young man looked at the poster again, then at Boone, then at the town watching in silence. "This isn't worth my time," he said finally. "Case is too old, evidence is circumstantial, and I've got better things to do than chase ghosts for people who probably aren't even asking anymore." He tore the poster in half. Let the pieces fall to the dirt. "You didn't see me," he said. "I didn't see you. We're square." He rode out within the hour, heading north toward easier bounties and clearer moral lines. Boone watched him go and felt something release in his chest. Not quite freedom. You never got completely free of what you'd done. But close enough. Acceptance that his past and present could coexist without destroying each other. That evening, he told Evelyn about the encounter. "You think he'll be back?" she asked. "No. He's smart enough to know when to let something go." Boone poured them both coffee. "And even if he did come back, it wouldn't matter. This is my home now. These are my people. Whatever I was before doesn't change what I am now." "And what are you now?" Boone thought about this. About the forge and the town and the life he'd built from the wreckage of what came before. About the school that bore his name and the people who called him friend. About the woman sitting across from him who'd seen his worst and chosen to stay anyway. "Someone who stopped running," he said finally. "Someone who figured out that you can't outrun yourself, but you can grow into someone better. Someone who learned that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a present that matters more." Evelyn raised her coffee cup. "I'll drink to that." They sat in comfortable silence as night settled over Red Hollow, the canyon walls darkening to shadow, stars beginning to emerge in the vast desert sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The wind moved through the settlement, carrying the smell of sage and dust and possibility. This was home. Imperfect, complicated, hard-won home. And that was enough, more than enough. 20 years after Boone Mercer walked out of his forge and destroyed the Rider Gang, Red Hollow had become something no one had expected. The schoolhouse had expanded twice, now serving children from 3 counties. The town had real law enforcement, 3 deputies and a marshal who actually did their jobs. The streets were paved. There was a telegraph office and a bank, and even a small newspaper that published weekly. Progress, people called it. But the old-timers, the ones who'd been there when it mattered, they knew better. They knew Red Hollow had changed not because of railroads or commerce or any of the usual forces that built towns. It had changed because 2 people refused to stay down when the world kicked them. Because a seamstress learned to shoot and a blacksmith remembered how to fight. Because someone finally said enough. Boone was in his 60s now, his hair gone completely gray, his body carrying the accumulated damage of a hard life. He still worked the forge, though not as many hours. His hands shook sometimes from old injuries that never quite healed right. But he could still shape iron when needed, still taught the occasional young person how to work metal with respect and precision. Evelyn's hair had gone silver, but her spine stayed straight. Her shop was now run mostly by the girls she'd taken in and trained over the years, women who'd gone on to build their own lives but came back to help. She spent most of her time these days teaching, not sewing, but the harder lessons about strength and standing up and refusing to be victimized. They were old together, which felt like its own kind of victory. One evening, sitting on the porch of the house they'd eventually built together, watching the sun set over the canyon, Evelyn asked the question that had been circling for years. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Boone knew what she meant. The violence, the stand, the choice to stop running and plant roots in a place that might have gotten him killed. "Every day," he said honestly, "and not at all." "That doesn't make sense." "Sure it does. I regret the necessity of it. Regret that the world is the kind of place where violence sometimes answers violence. Regret that I couldn't find a better way." He paused, watching the light fade. But I don't regret standing up. Don't regret protecting people who needed protecting. Don't regret building a life here with you. Those things I'd do again in a heartbeat. Even knowing what it cost? Especially knowing what it cost. Because the cost was real. The scars, the nightmares, the weight of knowing I'm capable of terrible things. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was watching people suffer and doing nothing. Living safe and small and alone. And that's not living at all. That's just slow death disguised as survival. Evelyn took his hand. Her grip was still strong despite the arthritis that made sewing harder than it used to be. We did good, didn't we? In the end, we did what we could. Whether that's good depends on who's judging. Boone squeezed her hand gently. But I think we gave people something important, hope. The idea that you can stand up, that one person can make a difference, that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. They sat in silence as the stars emerged, the desert cooling around them, the town settling into its evening rhythms. From somewhere down the street came the sound of hammer on anvil, one of the young blacksmiths Boone had trained, working late on a project. The sound carried through the canyon like a heartbeat, steady and strong. The next generation, learning the craft, carrying it forward. That sound would outlast them both, would echo through Red Hollow long after everyone who remembered the Rider Gang was gone, would remind future generations that iron could be shaped into tools or weapons, and the choice between them defined what kind of person you were, what kind of town you were. Boone closed his eyes and listened to those hammer strikes rolling through the darkness, mixing with the wind and the distant sounds of life continuing its messy, beautiful, complicated way. And he thought, this is what redemption sounds like. Not silence, not erasure of the past, but the steady rhythm of work continuing, of people building, of communities refusing to give up or give in. The sound of hammers in the dark, shaping something better from raw material. That was legacy enough.